Welcome back. It's 1 p.m. on the 20th of June, continuing our Management Audit Committee meeting. And we are right on schedule. So the next topic for we welcome the Governor's Office. I see Chief of Staff, former President, former Chairman, former a lot of things, and still number one in so many people's hearts. Chief Perkins is here, so great to see you. And many other new guests have joined us, and the Governor's staff is here, so welcome. Betsy and Gabby, and yep, see some other folks here for education stuff, I'll bet. All right, so first thing on our committee is Senate confirmation process, and there's an introduction that says I have to say something. This came up in the Senate, as the Senate has a role in confirmations, and there was a discussion about both statutory requirements for particular agencies there's some uniquenesses by agency in some of them, and then a broader understanding of what a term is for a governor and when it has been traditional that confirmations have taken place, i.e. in the beginning of someone's second term, do they go through and reconfirm all their members or all their appointees or not? So that was a discussion that happened right at the end of the session. So it may not be directly relevant to actions that the House members have taken, but there are certainly legislative and constitutional requirements in this. And as there are 3 former House members who are now in the Senate sitting right here on this committee, you too may be a part of that particular process at some point, confirmation process. So anyway, with that, Mr. Cheney has prepared a white paper on this issue, and then we'll hear from the Governor's office and certainly take any public comment. Do we have anybody that signed up for public comment on this, anything this afternoon, Kelly? Okay. Okay, thank you. And now we have State Lands here, Director Scoggins and Deputy Director here. Welcome. So, Pierre, please take it away and just a high level fly through executive overview, and then we'll take questions and we'll move on to the executive branch. Thank you.
Chairman Barlow, members of the committee, Pierre Chenet with LSO, and I present to you a research memorandum on the Senate confirmation process for governor's appointees. The memorandum provides an overview of the Senate confirmation process and details the process when an appointee's term expires at the end of a governor's term in office. I'll first provide a brief history and overview of the Senate confirmation process. Until 1979, Wyoming statutes did not provide a uniform confirmation process for appointees. Instead, statutes for positions that required Senate confirmation only stated that appointments had to be confirmed by the Senate. And on page 2, you may see 2 examples of that language. In 1979, the legislature enacted Wyoming Statutes 28-12-101 through 103, establishing a uniform confirmation process for all appointments. Under the uniform confirmation process, the governor must submit to the Senate the name, address, and occupation of each nominee for public office for which Senate confirmation is required by statute or by the Constitution. The governor must provide that information by noon on the 30th legislative day during a general session and on the 12th day during a budget session. Upon receiving the nominee's information, the Senate reviews his or her qualifications in the matter it determines and either confirms or rejects the nominee by roll call vote within 5 days. If the Senate rejects the nomination, when the legislature is still in session, the governor must submit another nominee. If the legislature is no longer in session, the governor may fill the vacancy with a temporary appointment, which is effective until March 1st of the following year. In 1996, the legislature amended the uniform confirmation process to include language regarding appointments for which political affiliation was specified by law. The amendment established that the governor must provide the Senate with a document showing the nominee's compliance with Wyoming Statute 9-1-218 subsection E. And under that subsection, a nominee must have been a member of the same political party for not less than 6 months before the date of nomination for appointments made during the legislative session, and for not less than 6 months before the date of appointment for temporary appointments. In addition, before Senate confirmation, nominees must file in the governor's office an affidavit stating their party affiliation. As I mentioned before, the uniform confirmation process requires the Senate to determine a process to review nominees' qualification. And Senate Rule 16 outlines that process, and an overview of that process is available on pages 3 and 4. I'll now shift to the second part of the memorandum, starting on page 4, concerning the process when an appointee's term expires at the end of a governor's term in office. In 1989, the legislature enacted the Wyoming Government Reorganization Act to organize the executive branch into a limited number of departments. The Act, and specifically Wyoming Statute 9-2-108, established that department directors must be appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. The Act also provides that a department director's term of appointments expires at the end of a governor's term in office, during which that director was appointed. While Wyoming statutes do not define the word term, the Constitution does. In Article 4, subsection 1 reads, "The executive power shall be vested in a governor who shall hold his office for the term of 4 years." During the 2023 general session, the governor did not reappoint all the department directors appointed during his first term. And you may see on the last page of Appendix B a complete list of appointments. It is unclear whether the current governor's interpretation of the statute differs from previous governors, or if it is a continued interpretation of that statute. And with that, I'll now stand for any questions you may have.
Right, thank you. Pierre, any questions for Mr. Cheney? For Mr. Cheney? Questions? Questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I think just jump right in to invite the governor's office, and the chief of staff's name is not on the agenda, but we would give him special dispensation. I think just out of general courtesy for as a former chairman of management audit, we think you ought to actually come sit up here. Take some of this. Anyway, thank you, chief staff, for being here. Good morning, Ms. Farmer, and good morning, Ms. Anderson, or afternoon, excuse me. Welcome. Introduce yourselves and take it away.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Betsy Anderson. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff and General Counsel for Governor Gordon. I think what we'll do is, Gabby, one of the questions was kind of our process on how we go about appointments, and also a little bit about maybe if there are any struggles or issues involved in that process. And so Gabby will do that for you, and then I am happy to kind of respond to LSO's memo on the appointment and the reelection issue. So,
Perfect, thank you. Ms. Farmer, if you'd introduce yourself and then proceed.
Thank you, Chairman, members. I'm Gabby Farmer. I'm Governor Gordon's assistant for board and commission appointments. As Betsy mentioned, I'll just give a brief overview of our process that we do for Senate confirmed appointments. So there are approximately 150 state boards that the governor makes appointments to, and 46 of those are Senate confirmed. We did provide you a handout, a couple handouts, a list of the Senate confirmed boards and a list of the non-confirmed boards. And on that handout on the left, the right column, there's numbers that reflect the numbers of positions that the governor makes appointments to. that doesn't necessarily reflect all of the positions that are on a particular board. It just is the numbers that the governor makes appointments to. Our process, we began reviewing the positions in about November or October each year. Majority of the Senate confirmed boards, their terms expire end of February, and new terms begin in March. So that gives us about 4 or 5 months to find qualified applicants. We do coordinate and communicate with the board directors and the agency directors, since typically they're the ones that have direct contact and more contact with those boards. So we do process applications and receive their input. We find pretty valuable. And once the members are selected for appointment, as was mentioned, they do have to fill out an oath of office, and if it's applicable, they fill out a party affiliation affidavit. And both of those documents must be notarized. And in the party affiliation affidavit just confirms that that individual has been affiliated with the party for at least 6 months prior to their nomination. We also produce a quarterly vacancy report. And this report can be found on the governor's webpage. It's a downloadable PDF. It reflects all of our current vacancies and the positions that are upcoming and set to expire within the next 3 months. It reflects all of the qualifications that an individual must meet in order to fill that position. We update it every quarter, every 3 months. Usually around session time, we project those positions out 6 months in advance, so that the public has a bit more notice on the positions we're going to look at. And that's a great recruitment tool. There are generally 4 requirements that we look at when we have to look at positions and how to fill those. The first being party affiliation. Does the board have a party split? Generally, it's no more than 75% of the board can be affiliated with one particular party. Second is the term limits. Are the members eligible for reappointment? Are they not? Third would be district requirements. And with the district requirements, we do have to rotate counties. So that each county has fair representation with each new appointment. And lastly is the discipline requirements. Does the member have to fall under a certain category? Do they have to be certified or licensed in a particular sector, industry? The governor is always very thoughtful, even if a requirement is not obligated on the board. He's always very thoughtful of having diverse representation on each board. He keeps in mind statewide representation, gender, industries. It's always something he considers, even if it's not a statutory requirement. One of the most common questions we receive from the public is, why are certain boards on the Senate confirmed list and some are not? And there's not necessarily any set criteria or guidelines to help establish which boards are to be Senate confirmed. It's just set in statute by the legislature. And so that's just something we have to allude to when we get asked that question. For example, there are only a handful of licensing boards on the Senate confirmed list, and a variety that are not. Another difficulty, one difficulty we face is when there are district and disciplines, when there's that combination. Oftentimes we have to find a particular, maybe an engineer from a particular county and there might only be a handful, and maybe none of those individuals are interested in serving. So when there's that combination, that's the one that's most difficult for us to process. Some of the boards specifically that are pretty difficult for us, the School Facilities Commission, because of the amount of requirements that individuals must meet in order to serve. The Water Development Commission, is pretty similar because of the amount of requirements those individuals must meet. And finally, the Unemployment Insurance Commission, there's only 3 commissioners on that board, and they take on quite a bit of work, so it can be difficult to find individuals that have time to serve on that board. And lastly, some of the public members on the licensing boards, those positions can be difficult to fill. Oftentimes the licensing boards have term limits, so those members, even if they are still interested in continuing to serve, they do have to step down for us to find someone else. And we don't necessarily want to suggest that those positions be excluded. We certainly understand the importance of that perspective on those boards. It's just a difficulty we face. And lastly, not necessarily a difficulty, but something that's a bit odd for us is the timing for when the appointments are confirmed. Depending on how the calendar falls each year, it may be that the Senate is voting to confirm appointments after terms have started or supposed to start in March. So may be a few days of limbo where we're waiting on confirmation before we can get those people started on the boards. And I'll go ahead and leave it at that. And if there's not any questions, I'll turn it over to our deputy.
Thank you, Mrs. Farmer. Any questions? Any questions? So I guess I have two questions. You have confirmed versus non-confirmed. Are there any boards or commissions that are actually paid positions? The Public Service Commission comes as one example in my head, but are there others that, and you mentioned the unemployment one as being a difficult one because of the potential time commitment. So are there any others that are time commitment heavy and pay poor? Or you see what I'm saying? Is there something we need to take a look at there? So go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. There are certain boards that receive reimbursements and some boards that are paid. I don't know all of those boards off the top of my head, but we can get you a list. It's specified in each one of their statutes. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Chairman Barlow. Just a quick question for, in this case, I believe, Ms. Farmer. What is the vacancy rate, or more importantly, how's your fulfillment rate? Are we in the 90s, and how does that compare now to versus a couple of years ago?
Ms. Farmer.
So I can speak to my experience while in this position. We are filling vacancies more frequently than we have in the past. One of our projects has been recruitment, trying to get the word out to fill those vacancies. The vacancy report has been really beneficial for us. The boards themselves help with recruitment, and they're able to put on their own websites or their newsletters positions that need to be filled. So I would say it's been better. Vacancies are a little bit less than they have been, but we still have quite a bit.
So would you speak to just an average open vacancy rate out of the hundreds of vacancies that we're talking about? 2%, 3% at a time that are open because of qualifications, just a rotating number? What are we looking at? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't know if we don't really track percentage-wise. I could get you a general number if you'd like.
That's good. If there's not a big number sticking in your head, that's probably okay. Go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, on the vacancy issue, we can try to get you a percent. A couple of things. Gabby's done a phenomenal job since she came into this position. We now use a software program that she has done a great job of putting together and getting a ton of bells and whistles in that really has helped fill these vacancies. But to your question about problems and difficulties, it came to our attention, in fact, just in the last month or so, and I'm going to give an example, and I hope I have some of this right, but the Hearing Aid Examiners Board, apparently, they have had a vacancy for 10 years. And the deal is that it requires an audiologist, and there are only 3 in the state, and they don't want to serve. So while you look at that vacancy list, there are problems on there that they do indicate some problems. That's a situation where I would say to a director, you need to go and come to us and tell us this is a problem. We need to try to get with you to help fix that type of problems, because obviously that probably affects quorum issues and that type of stuff. But I think we're getting to the point. It was a heavy lift because we did switch systems when Governor Gordon took office. I'm hoping we're getting to a point where we can now, our office can now start identifying those prolonged vacancies and try to get with those directors or agencies and say, what can we do about trying to get this fixed? So, but this has been a process. And I just commend Gabby. She's done a fabulous job on that.
So that's one example on a specific qualification, professional qualification. Would you speak to the county rotation and maybe partisan splits and things like that? I mean, are there, I say this because I've been in some, I was on a board that rotated through different communities. It's hard to find a sheep producer in Niobrara County that wants to serve on a state board, just being honest. That's the way, there may be 2 of them, but they don't want to serve on a state board, and that's the livestock board. So would you speak to any of that? I mean, part of what we can maybe do with this is address some of those concerns, those unique circumstances. Then there's a broader question. But so anyway, so go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Gabby mentioned the School Facilities Commission, and when we first started, Director McComey was head of state construction and over the school facilities, and came to us, and I can't remember the exact, but he was looking, the discipline requirement was some type of certified engineer, and I think he was having to look for this person from the district requirement in, I don't know, Weston County. And he spent 2 or 3 months looking until finally somebody came to him and said, we don't have a certified engineer, the type you're looking for in Weston County. And so that overlay, as Gabby mentioned, of the disciplines and the districts, you know, you have somebody that term is expired and they happen to represent this discipline in this district. We're now have to fill that district, so we have to rotate to the next county, and we have to find somebody with that discipline. And in some respects, you're now limited with the expiration and how those things rotate. You're now always trying to find that particular discipline in that particular district. And I don't think that's what was intended, is that, you know, the person that knows bid estimates always has to come from District 6. I don't think that's what was intended, but that's how it ends up falling out with the way the terms expire.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any further questions on this particular issue on the qualifications, timing and qualifications? No? Yes, Vice Chairman Brown.
Betsy, thanks, and Gabby, thank you guys for being here and giving us a lot of the information. One of my questions, I guess, is mainly going to, when you guys are saying that people are denying stepping onto these boards and these commissions, one of the things that I've noticed is the political vitriol that has been with the fallout and these political appointees and serving on these positions and how political they've become. Is that one of the main issues that you guys are seeing? Is it the time commitment? What is stopping the people that are wanting to come onto these boards? Because, you know, is I was asked to serve on a board for the mayor. There's a couple of people you just don't say no to, and one of those is typically the governor, right? So if you're saying no to a position like this, what are those reasons, and what is going on with that? And is it something that that we can address at the legislative level, or is it something, as you guys are saying, that right now there's a lot of the particulars, so I think we could work on that, but is there something else that's stopping this too?
Bearing in mind, the legislature says no to the governor all the time, so take that all with a grain of salt, but anything that you might be able to offer, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and Representative Brown. Majority of the time, it's time commitment, not having the availability to serve and commit that time. It could be various other issues, but that's the main concern.
So that brings up something, and this goes back to my board appointment, that depending on where you are in the cycle and what controversies are going on, brucellosis again, Wyoming Livestock Board, that was during my tenure in the Livestock Board, we had several brucellosis outbreaks. It did take a lot of time, and the folks that came on before me were like, oh no, it doesn't take that much time. Wrong answer. It becomes very, can become very time consuming when you're doing public meetings in 7 different communities because people are having their livestock quarantined. So it's variable too. Would you say that something that may not take much time for 3 or 4 years all of a sudden starts consuming a lot of time because of this change in law or change in circumstance that we can't foresee? Is that also something that you're saying? Thank you.
Chairman, I would agree. They have a set number of meetings each year, but typically they meet more than that, just depending on what might come up in the year. So yes, it's not necessarily straight shot.
Thank you. So I think anything else further from the committee? I think one thing that would be helpful if we're going to develop is if you have that matrix, as you say your database may be robust enough to kind of say, this is where we're having challenges, this is where we end up in these places where we need an engineer, a very specialized engineer from Niobrara County, and because of the rotations, so maybe we give the governor some flexibility in certain boards or commissions that says, look, you got to be within the district, or got to be some flexibility. Because I don't want to, and I don't know, how's that being handled now? I guess that's the first question. How's it being handled now? And can you give us, some suggestions about how we could address some specific ones that might be helpful to the executive branch? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we'll be
Please.
happy to put together some information and put together those the particular boards we find the struggles with. I will point out, as Gabby pointed out, the public members for the licensing board, it is what it is. You probably need a public member on there. You want that industry to have, you want the customers and clients of that industry to have a voice on those boards. But it's just, it is hard to find people that are, Judy Smith and I really am interested in land surveying and engineering, and I want to be a public member on that board. It's hard. And so I think trying to figure out ways to recruit that is something that we need to work on. So I don't know that there's an answer to that challenge, but the other ones I can certainly put together and show you ones that we struggle with sometimes.
And I would also be interested or I think it'd be helpful to know the ones that are compensated in some way, whether it's, I think most of them, hopefully most of them get their expenses, their per diem expenses, but if there's any other additional compensation, other than those that are obviously full-time, which is Public Service Commission, et cetera. So, but if there are any of those out there, that'd be helpful to know. Any other questions for the governor's office on this particular part of it, the appointment process and those individual challenges?
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Start that in. Senator Nethercott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if we were going to hit this at another time. Of course, the Senate sometimes is frustrated. This has been communicated, but potentially we can address this here. where the governor identifies the appointments, which then becomes public before the Senate confirms them. And the Senate has struggled with that because then the Senate has to go talk to the governor and talk to the person and say, you have just announced on your own personal social media or hit your local newspaper that you've been appointed by the governor to some board, but the Senate doesn't confirm you or may not confirm you. And so there's just a disconnect with the timing of that from the Senate's perspective that would be better served, I think, to those volunteers to have alleviated in some way. And in defense to the governor, since I've been in the Senate, both governors that I have served with have suffered the same concern. I think it surprises us both, the Senate and the governor's offices, the timing of that in anticipation of a legislative session and all the other things that need to get done. The Senate confirmations are not a priority. And so we all find ourselves last minute going, this is going to be painful or not fair to a person involved. And so who's not elected, right? Who is being asked to volunteer and for whatever reason does not get confirmed by the Senate. So that process and timeline definitely needs to get fixed to protect those people.
Ms. Anderson, if you want to respond to that, or certainly the chief of staff, if he'd like to come up.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, so we don't publish a list to the public until noon of the day that we are to submit it to you. So there is no public list published until that point in time, and we do put out a press release. At the same time, we bring the clerk of the Senate the list. Now, Gabby's having to communicate to all these people, explain to them they are on the list and confirm everything. So people out there know that they are going to be appointed subject to confirmation. Now, maybe that's what you're talking about, is that they are going out and telling people I'm been appointed, because we are not publishing anything public to the, that
Okay, so I think we have,
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Mr.
No, no,
Chairman,
you
I'm
go
so
ahead.
sorry. There are interim appointments, which we are allowed to make in the middle of the year, and we do announce those. We have an interim appointment. By law, they serve with all the authority and responsibilities as a appointee, as a confirmed appointee. It is still subject to their appointment. So those, yes, those are public. But when it gets down to, we're putting in the list of the 300 names that, not 300, that's total 150 names. We are not publishing that publicly, and maybe I'm misunderstanding.
actually, I have Representative Ottman. Did you have a question still? Okay, all right. Senator Grew, follow up on the Nethercott question, follow up on the.
Follow up on the follow-up on the fly. I bet, sorry, I apologize for being late. I think what the good senator was asking is, and it kind of goes to the heart of, I think, some of the rub that gets into this, why people don't want to apply. The list becomes public, exactly as you said. It comes public at noon. We get it at noon, and then we do advise and consent. In the past, I don't know, right, wrong, or indifferent, there was another way. The list came to us, not publicly, a week before. Then members, usually, and I'm too political, the majority party would get a chance to look at the list, as all of us would. But then they could caucus, and if there were names that they had trouble with, for whatever reason, then they could quietly put that list back to the governor and say, there are some potential problems here, here, and here. Then the governor could quietly, in a more, discreet session, thank you, be able to make some changes. And if not, if the governor chose, no, this is my person on this board, and I want that vote, then so be it. Then that's the way it works. Then he fights and we get him and lobbies and does the thing. But if there was some way to do that, that might take some of that angst out of it for folks, an attorney, that they're not going to get put in the spotlight.
Ms. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Grew, so when Governor Gordon first took office, yes, we understood that was the tradition. Nothing required, nothing statute or rule. That was the tradition, and we did do that in 2019. I'm going to speak a little frankly. We did that, and unfortunately, we felt like misrepresentations were made to us with regards to the success or the opposition to candidates on that list. And that was disappointing. I think it was frustrating. The process that the Senate took in that time between giving the list and the actual publication and statutory requirement that we filed that list, that process is very opaque to us. We have no understanding of your process. We have no understanding of what factors are considered. Are you looking at qualifications? Are you looking at experience? Are you looking at skills? Are you looking at integrity or something else? We have no idea. And it was very frustrating on our side of the equation. And I will, again, the process to us, we don't understand. In this last session, there was opposition to a particular board nominee. That nominee was not asked to testify at a hearing. The nominee was not given a chance to defend themselves, to express what their qualifications and experience are and why they would be a good board member. And we felt like certainly if there's knowledge of some opposition of a candidate, that you would certainly give them an opportunity to come in and speak on their own behalf. So all those things pile up, and those frustrations of not understanding your process and what you're looking at and what your concerns and considerations are meant that we thought the best thing was to follow the statute and publish the list when the time was right.
Thank you. Thank you. Follow-up, Senator Grew.
First, and please convey this to Governor, I couldn't agree more with everything you just said. But that having been said, my question is, okay, now we've done it the other way. Do y'all think it's better? Because personally, I don't know if that's true. So I was going to get the governor's take on it. That doing it the way we do it, does that seem to be working better?
Ms. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Grew, I don't think either process is that great. I think some frustrations with, as I said before, the misrepresentations about whether the success or opposition of I think led the governor to take some action that maybe he wouldn't have otherwise. And so at that point, maybe it's better just not to get that information in advance. So again, it's just not privy to your process and what you're looking at. It makes it very difficult to take information back and understand what that means.
And thank you very much, and I thank you for the candidates. And I'll be candid as a freshman senator. I don't know what our process is either, so just so we're on the same page. I think another question, and I think I'd probably get to it in a bit here, is the second term issue and resubmittal of the entirety. So if you go ahead and speak to that, and that, I mean, how we think we understand statute and how maybe other people are reading it. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we did want to speak to that. Saw LSO's white paper. And they did cite the Constitution, where the Constitution says that the governor, quote, shall hold his office for a term of 4 years. That's not the end of the sentence. The sentence continues and says, and until his successor is elected and duly qualified. So we believe that this means that his term expires once his elector is elected and duly qualified. And therefore, we did not consider it necessary to submit all the directors' names upon his reelection. I'm not aware of anything that says that those confirmations are now invalid, now that he's reelected. He is the same person the day before he's reelected as the day after, and he has his team, and there's not a big difference in for him and his cabinet. And then I will also note that, we did look into it, and the prior administration did the same thing. When that governor was reelected in 2015, we looked, and 7 directors were put up for confirmation in 2015. And so it seems, I didn't check back further than that, but at least in recent history, that seems to be the tradition upon reelection. And so that's our interpretation, and why we did not put up the entire cabinet.
Thank you. So to be clear, we're relying just on that constitutional interpretation, the difference in unconstitutional potential interpretation. There's no statutory that your citation goes to, is there? Aside from, there are certain boards and commissions where I think it's more explicit in statute.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, yes, there are certain, and I believe it's not a good example because the state engineer is in Constitution, but they have a particular term, 6 years. So in that situation, it really more coincides with the term of that particular director as opposed to the term of the governor. Somebody like, to use an example, she's sitting here, but director of OSLI, there's not a term to that. And so that really is more connected to the term of the governor. But something like the state engineer that has a particular term of years, that would override and would be connected to the years and not the term of the governor.
Okay, thank you. Representative Ottman, you just have a question, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of this discussion. And I like the examples to know the historical actions, problems, and successes. What I was wondering was if there is vacancies, whether they're paid or not paid, or financed or not financed, doesn't that encumber the ability of those boards to be active and to make decisions and to actually be productive? Or is there a mechanism? Because what I heard was that could eliminate the quorum so that things couldn't proceed. Is it that important? I mean, is it really inhibiting the bureaus from action, or is it something that's just being taken care of? Thank you.
Yeah, either one of you want to go. That's a little bit back on our previous topic, but go ahead and respond to that. Size of the board matters, right, on the quorum issue. So, but go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes. I would say that the vacancies creating a quorum issue are not common. On a smaller board, if you have one person who's gone, if you have one vacancy, and then for some reason you have only one person gets sick, or one person unfortunately is out of town at a wedding or something, it would be a compounding situation, that the vacancy on top of the certain board members not being able to attend, you might get to a point where you have a quorum issue. I mean, we have boards that are Board of Barbers is 3 people. I mean, we do have boards that are quite small. And so that is, and they would just have to reschedule their meeting because they don't have a quorum. So it is not a burden that they can't overcome, but it is something that they have to think about. And then your question about the compensation, and I'm going to make sure Gabby corrects me, but as the chairman said, we have full-time board members, we have Board of the Public Service Commission, we have the Board of Equalization. Those are all appointments. They are full-time and they're paid a salary. I think most boards provide for travel reimbursement, but I think there are some boards that provide the legislative pay. That's, I think, what Gabby is referring to. So they are paid, and an example I can give is the new Stable Token Commission. They can have subject matter experts on the commission. They are paid as you are as a legislator, and they get their travel reimbursement for the days that they serve. And so that would be the type of compensation that board members would receive. So I don't know that it's I don't know, maybe you think you get paid a whole lot, but the legislative compensation is not like a salary. It's not going to be something that they can make a living off for an entire year. Or maybe some of you do, but.
Thank you very much. Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just out of curiosity, are most of your vacancies on these unpaid or unreimbursed position boards? Or are most of the boards that are currently being given a per diem or something like that, are they primarily all occupied and full? Do you struggle to fill those positions and more so struggle to fill positions that are unpaid, basically time given boards?
Ms. Farmer, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Nyman, I would say majority of the board's members serve as volunteers. Majority are not compensated for their service. So yes, a majority of the vacancies are on boards that are not compensated, but that's, I think, simply because a large majority don't receive any sort of compensation other than their travel reimbursements. So I don't know if it's necessarily a factor, a huge factor for people to consider, an issue for them when they're thinking about applying for boards.
Thank you. Further questions? Further questions? Further questions for the executive? Tara? All right. Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I'm going back to the Senate confirmation process is on our agenda. We need to fix it. It doesn't work well. I agree with the governor's criticisms of the Senate's process and appreciate those concerns and appreciate the candid answer. In defense of the Senate, the history, because somebody has to, senators, there was never an issue before, historically, for a long time. The governor sent his appointments, the Senate confirmed them, it wasn't a thing. And then it became a thing. And it has continued to be a major issue. The first year I was in, we just confirmed them. We looked over the list. It was fine, confirmed. It took 20 minutes out of the session to accomplish. And then things became partisan, very, very partisan. The first Senate confirmation that I recall being of issue generally concerned, I would say, more legitimate concerns of the person assigned to the board associated with their public policy positions associated with energy development in Wyoming. And so the particular board of which they were being asked to serve on dealt with that issue. And so there was, I would say, a credible, legitimate, objective, rational basis concern associated with that appointment. Since that time, it's all been very personal and partisan. Most of it being connected to individuals' elections within the Senate, and some person involved with an appointment, is somehow connected to an individual senator's campaign. That is what it has turned into. There's no way to avoid that with the Senate confirmation process. Individual senators' personal feelings about appointees is just how that looks in the Senate. But I do think a more clearly defined, transparent process is important for both the Senate, the governor's office, and these volunteer citizens of our state to not continue on the trajectory of which we are on in the Senate, which is these very public and personal debates on the floor concerning these individuals. And so I would like LSO potentially to help identify how other other legislatures, Senate chambers do gubernatorial appointments, and see if there's maybe a smarter way, and then also just ourselves come up with a more transparent process. And maybe that has to do with timing, the ability to communicate, maybe not just with a delegated few who come to the governor's office and communicate the wishes of the body, which I think is likely where the misinformation has come in. So the actual representation of the Senate as a whole is not accurately being communicated, which is unfortunate, but which has occurred and results in real harm, real public harm to individuals unfairly. And so I think that can be remedied, and I look forward to working on that this interim in this committee with learning information from LSO and this committee's work with the governor's office. It just can't continue on this way.
Thank you, Senator Nethercott. Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I couldn't agree more with my Senate patriot here, that we're not Washington, D.C., right? This state is a very small city, very long roads in between. And we're all very closely connected, whether we want to admit it or not. And the amount of hardship that some of these people have faced in just the past couple of years through the Senate confirmation process is truly unbecoming of what I've seen in the legislative process. And so while I agree there's a portion of trying to get into politics, there's also a point in the level of, public service. These people are putting their lives out there and doing public service for the good of maybe a legislative salary. Most of the time, they're just getting reimbursements. And so I completely agree that the system is flawed right now. And when we're trying to get people to serve, we've got 580,000 people in this state. Of those, a little less than half are eligible to serve on these boards. And of those, I would say maybe 1% are willing to do it. And we keep dwindling that down because of this partisan political atmosphere that has invaded the process. So I would ask, very similarly to the senator, if you guys have some thoughts and some ideas, and the Senator Guru has mentioned this as well, certainly the House members are outside of this. We don't really have much say in this, other than it's our state too, right? We may not have the advice and the consent, but it's our state too, and we have a vested interest in who these directors are as well, because we're working with them in our standing committees on a regular basis. So if you guys have some ideas, it would be helpful. Working with our LSO staff, working with the chairman and myself to see if we can come up with something different that maybe provides a little bit of protection, but also being transparent. I think there's also a point in being very transparent with this process. So I agree, we need to do something to fix this. Up until the past probably 4 to 5 years, it was a smooth process. And as the senator stated, it was 20 to 30 minutes and it was done and over with. Now it's become a slog fest to get somebody through the process. And I'll state it again, we're not Washington, D.C. We're not doing Senate confirmations here of the United States Supreme Court. We're trying to make sure that we take care of the state of Wyoming with good directors and good commissions and good boards. So I would appreciate the governor's work on this, in your office and bringing us some ideas as we move forward with this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank goodness for the Judicial Nomination Commission.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I can.
What's that?
For the
Please.
House members who probably don't know what it looks like because you're in session on the other side doing your work, it is awful. And in some ways it is transparent, because if a senator really doesn't want a name to move forward, as the governor has published, the governor's forced our hands in electing this process as a result of evidently feeling burned, probably appropriately so. Now, what happens and has happened is a senator gets up and moves for the removal of someone's name. And so a senator stands up and says, I move for the removal of John Smith, and then states why. And they never state the true reason, and it's some other reason. And so in order to keep the person on the board, another senator has to argue in favor of keeping them there. And so we're having a debate on the Senate floor in session, live on YouTube with people, about an individual. It's a very specific individual, right? It's not a bill or a policy or ideas. It is John Smith. And it is the most terrible thing, right, for John Smith, who did not choose to be elected, right, who just responded to a call from the governor to serve on some, usually, board of some level, varying degrees of importance or influence. And all of a sudden, they individually are being debated on the Senate floor. It is not what we are meant to be doing, I don't think. And so that's why this process needs to look differently, because it isn't fair to those people. So just so you know, that's what that looks like from the House side. That's what it looks like in the Senate. It's not a bill, it's a person.
Thank you. Further discussion? So I would make one observation, and this will be something that I think we ought to also take a look at, is of the list of Senate confirmed boards, are they necessary? Are some of these boards, is it necessary to the Board of Barber Examiners? I mean, let's be honest, three people in the state of Wyoming. First of all, should there be a Board of Barber Examiners? I'm not going there, just saying right now, not going there. But should we have a combined cosmetology barbers board to begin with? So anyway, I just throw that out there because cosmetology is not a governor-appointed board, but barbers are. There's your sign. I'm just saying we actually need to probably examine the boards themselves to see which ones make sense or not. I think Public Service Committee, there are certain ones that have a significant public policy nexus. Those make sense potentially to continue with a confirmation process. But I think maybe that's the first discussion we have, is of the ones that are appointed or confirmed, are there some of those that we should actually have the conversation about they should not be affirmed? Notwithstanding the fact that do we need these boards, some of these boards anymore? Are they actually, do they have a function in state government? Or they have been overtaken by other functions, et cetera? So anyway, I hope this committee thinks about that as well a little bit, and maybe we get some feedback from the governor's office about where there is that disconnect. Cosmetology isn't, barbers are. We can keep two boards, but one isn't, one is Senate confirmed and one is not. Just saying, I mean, I went to the barber yesterday, but I'm just saying. Thankfully, that board, I don't know that I cared if the Senate confirmed that barber in no matter what state he went from. But anyway, so I do think that there's, Industrial Siting Council, we may think that one a little bit differently. Industrial Siting Council has a very significant role in communities and public policy. So go ahead, Mrs. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, two things. You talked about, do we even need these boards? Just a little bit of history, because I don't know that many of you were on the management audit a couple of years ago. We did take the Alvarez and Marcel study when Governor came in office. I don't think we did the licensing boards, but we sent out a survey. Our office did all the boards, all the directors, and they said, number one, do you really need this board? Is it constitutionally created? I'm not going to worry about it if it's constitutionally created. I mean, we had all these questions. Do you need that many people? Could you merge with another board? I mean, we had a ton of questions. And we did come back with a bill to management audit a couple of years ago with some of those efficiencies. Not as many as I would have liked, but so I just want you to know that we have kind of gone through that process. Probably something that should be looked at every 10 years or so or something, because things change. But we have been through that process recently. And then as to who should be Senate confirmed and who not, I would offer that I think there are some on the not Senate confirmed list that maybe should be on the Senate confirmed list. We are not aware of any standard criteria for what board is Senate confirmed and which is not. And so I have to assume that when each board was created, or amendments came to those boards, that at that point, those legislators or council decided that that particular board should be Senate confirmed, and there's just no standard criteria that I'm aware of why you decide what list it falls on.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? Anybody online for this topic? Anybody in the room for this topic? No, former Representative Schwartz, you cannot speak to this topic. We have limits, even here. We did not hear from a former senator, so we do not have to hear from a former House member. So, Thank you very much. I think what we'll probably do is, any committee discussion on direction forward here? Are we going to mull this a little bit? Thoughts? Senator Nethercott?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would like to hear from LSO about other Senate's confirmation processes. It may just be a simpler fix, and then just our commitment to keep working on it. I do think that this is an appropriate conversation for this committee. One, Management Council tasked us with this topic, but I think it does provide balance and objectivity to have House members weighing in, just to give that perspective and participation in this concept of the Senate confirmation process. Also giving House members time to look at the list too, right? And talk to the Senate about the confirmation process. Instead of, here's the list, mid-session, we're all doing our thing, and this whole chaotic process is underway in the third week of session, right, when we're going. So there might be a better way, and I appreciate the House's participation on that.
Yes, thank you. So, so we do have a request for some, at least maybe an NCSL review, see what they have on this type of process, or if there's something, they don't have something, maybe just a quick look at some other processes that might be helpful. And thank you. And I think what we'll do is, as soon as that's available, I think just provide it, when you think you have a work product or a product, just provide it to the committee, and let's post it actually onto this agenda's, the website on this agenda under this topic. And then if when it's on the next agenda, it'll be there too. But I'd like this one to reflect, we made this request and it's being added to the materials so people can see it. Yes, Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would it go along with that to also have maybe a criteria for which boards are Senate confirmed and which ones aren't, so that the legislators know how to, if it's by legislation, by statute, or if it, or what it's by, but that there would be more uniformity in doing that?
So, I mean, we do know based on what we have in statute. Are you asking what other states have done as far as who they appoint, confirm versus non-confirm?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Well, basically, with your example of the barber and the other, which one is and one isn't? So why is it that way?
Okay, and I appreciate that. That's just a component of when the law was passed. And the legislature decided these are Senate confirmed and these aren't. I don't know that there's not a rhyme or reason to this. This is just one at a time. We did these things and there's no criteria. I guess the point is there a generalized criteria about new boards or old boards? No. It's just what did the author of the bill put in, and what did the process give us? So now, do we want to revisit that and have that conversation? That is a multi-year, I think it's a multi-year conversation, because every one of these is a separate bill. I don't think you get to do an omnibus bill on 17 different boards. We've tried it before, or it's been tried before, and it usually gets pared down to the most likelihood. You could maybe make the case under Senate confirmation that you could say we could all roll this into one, but somebody would take exception and we just start chinking them out. So I just a caution. I'm not saying it's not possible. But anyway, we have a research paper being worked on. I think the second thing, if there is, some of those other states do have an example about, or criterion about when confirmation is needed or not, that would be helpful as well, if there's something out there. We don't have it. We just make it up as we go. You've got it. All right, anything further? Anything further from the governor's office? Thank you very much, Ms. Farmer. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Chief. Appreciate you. Have a great afternoon. All right, no further discussion on that? Nobody in the room, nobody online, correct? All right, perfect. We'll go on to our 2:30 agenda item at 2:04. And I'm pleased to have Kelly Lower from our research analyst come forward. She did a research paper on our state trust lands. It's called maximization, but I think it's more of an overview of all things state lands. So thank you very much. Please proceed. And just a high-level overview, then if you'll be willing to take questions from the committee, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
This paper outlines the history of state trust lands in the U.S., particularly western states, and specifically Wyoming's trust land history, management practices, statutory authority, and constitutional requirements for state trust lands. The office has a detailed presentation and materials, so I will not go into too much detail on management history and practices. However, I'll highlight that the background of state trust lands in the U.S., Wyoming state trust lands, Wyoming State Land Trust, I should say, and the trust land management practices and statutory authority that's outlined on pages 1 through 8 of this paper. I'll also note that Wyoming's active admission and constitution grants the state legislature broad authority over state trust land management. This stands in contrast to most other Western states, where trust language in their enabling acts has much stricter management requirements, as well as explicit trust language, whereas Wyoming's state lands trust is statutory in origin, not constitutional. Pages 4 through 8 describe trust land management practices in Wyoming, which include land sales, exchanges, and leasing, with leasing comprising the bulk of state trust land management, agricultural and mineral leasing being the most significant. Regarding revenue maximization, neither the Act of Admission nor the Constitution in Wyoming requires maximization of revenue from state trust lands. As I mentioned, the legislature is granted broad authority over management practices. Other states like Arizona, and New Mexico have much more restrictive language in their enabling act and constitution, and have requirements that all sales and leases receive full market value and go to public auction. There's also been much more case law in other states regarding revenue maximization and land management practices. For example, decisions in Arizona, Idaho, and Montana have challenged traditional trust land management practices, such as grazing and agricultural leases, on the grounds of revenue maximization. This has led some trust managers to consider alternative land uses, such as leasing grazing lands to conservation groups if they are the highest bidders, to maximize long-term income for the trust beneficiaries. Starting on page 9 of the paper, there have been a couple examples of legislation in Wyoming that refer to maximizing revenue from state trust lands. The 1997 Session Law, Chapter 200, Section 3 is one example. This outlines guidance for the Board of Land Commissioners and OSLI that prioritizes long-term revenue generation from state lands through leasing over short-term revenue maximization from sales. Another piece of legislation dealing with revenue maximization is the 2020 Session Law, Chapter 158, which created the State Trust Lands Proposal Act, requiring OSLI to seek proposals for opportunities for the development of identified school trust land parcels and any other state trust land in Teton County that would maximize the value of the land to the greatest extent possible. Pages 9 through 13 describe the process and results of this act, including the issuance of temporary use permits for 8 tracts within the Highway 390 parcel near Teton Village, which resulted in a significant revenue increase under the previous temporary use permits for these tracts. The last section of this paper, starting on page 13, discusses land management practices and revenue maximization in other states. In recent decades, Western states have struggled to reconcile shifting environmental and economic realities, as well as population growth, with resource extraction and development. These changes have led trust land managers to diversify trust portfolios, especially as school funding shortfalls and rapid growth rates exert pressure on trust managers to maintain or increase trust revenues. For example, through residential and commercial development on trust lands. Some examples of revenue maximization programs from other states include Montana's land banking program, also Montana's identification of trust land parcels with the highest and best use for commercial development. This is on page 14. Now on page 15, New Mexico's State Land Office has a large planning and development and business leasing division that issues planning and development leases. They also have a community partnership program that works with municipalities and counties throughout the state to identify trust land for its development potential, another example of a program targeting revenue maximization. And lastly, on page 16, Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration has a property planning and development group that identifies trust lands with a higher potential surface value for real estate development, land planning, and land conservation. However, I'll note all these states still generate the bulk of state land revenue from traditional uses, such as oil and gas royalties and agricultural leases. And with that, Mr. Chairman, if there are any questions?
Thank you very much. Any questions for Ms. Lohr? Questions from the committee? Questions from the committee? Is there anybody online on this topic here? Okay, thank you. No questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, I think we're ready for Office of State Lands. We have Director Scoggins and Deputy Director Crowder here. Welcome. So just so we're all prefaced and on the same page, this was not a topic that the management audit submitted to Management Council because we were seeking to learn about this. This was something that they, in their Management Council meeting, had it in several different places and decided to try to put it in one place, and we got that spin of the wheel. So this is not a topic. These folks have never been before us, I don't believe, ever. and neither are we. So first we'll start with educational, and then we'll try to see if there's some policy direction we maybe can work together on to find a path forward in this. So with that, welcome. Please introduce yourselves. And as with all of the folks, high level, and then if there are questions, we'll let that be generated more organically. So at your leisure, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jennifer Scoggin. I'm the Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. With me is Jason Crowder. He is the Deputy Director. We did provide a PowerPoint to the committee, but it's rather long, and hopefully you all have read it. And I think that the memorandum provided by the Legislative Services Office did a pretty good job of setting forth the high points. With respect to our PowerPoint, I think that the takeaways, there's a couple of them. First of all, about 81% of the revenue generated on trust lands comes from oil and gas. So obviously that's concerning. When there are downturns in the market, we really feel it with respect to revenue. If you looked at some of those graphs that were toward the back of the presentation, particularly the one with the green bars, you'll see that in 2020 through 2022, there's a significant decrease in revenue off of state trust lands. Of course, that was during COVID, when the oil and gas development in the state was largely idle. So we felt that, as did the trust beneficiaries. Grazing, while it's the most prevalent use of the surface of state trust lands, it still only generates about $5 million. So it's not huge, obviously, compared to what comes in from minerals and from oil and gas. But it is probably the most staff intensive. It takes a lot of staff to run those programs. The leasing programs are very prescriptive. There's a lot that goes into that that they have to be paying attention to. And we were fortunate enough because the legislature provided us with an additional position to help our grazing position person. So we're concerned about normalizing, if you will, state trust land revenue to the extent we can to kind of guard against all those fluctuations that you see with the ups and downs of the mineral industry and particularly the oil and gas industry. So we did put some challenges on a couple of slides there toward the back of the PowerPoint. And I'm just going to go through these sort of high level, and if you have questions, we can certainly answer them toward the end. But one of the things that, LSO did a really good job of talking about what some of the other states are doing with respect to trying to maximize revenue generation. And some of those talking about more commercial development, even potentially residential development on state trust lands. We've looked at that. We've worked with, I think, the Revenue Committee last session to try and figure out, are there ways we can do that? Currently, our long-term leasing only allows a 75-year term limit for a special use lease. Generally, when you see residential and that sort of things, banks are reluctant to lend if you're not going to have at least 99 years on that lease. Additionally, our statutes currently, while they allow for credit, if you will, for development or improvements, if you will, for grazing and agricultural leasing, they don't allow that same credit for commercial and residential developments that are on state land. Should somebody at some point want to sell that endeavor or otherwise walk away from it. The next thing that impacts our ability to generate revenue are the legislature's imposed statutory grazing fee, a formula, if you will, which we believe discounts the market rate. And you can find that in Wyoming Statute 36-5-105. But essentially, there's a formula that we have to utilize when we're figuring out what's considered fair market value. And that takes into consideration the private lease rate per AUM, averaged over 5 years preceding the year at issue, and the 5-year weighted average parity ratio for cattle. It also has a downward adjustment of 20% to reflect lessee contributions. So at the end of the day, I think our AUM rate is about $5.25, something like that, whereas the private market, you're seeing anywhere from $13 to $30 per AUM, depending upon. So it's a significant decrease. The next thing, if we're going to look at other ways to utilize state trust lands and to generate revenue, we've had opportunities presented to us, like from state parks and things like that, that we're unable to partner with them to do because we don't have the legislative authorization to do that. And one example would, I think, was it 2 years ago that we looked at running legislation that was kind of an experiment for the bus. I don't know how many of you know what the bus is, but apparently it's a mountain bike trail system that's near Lander. And the public utilizes that space a lot. But there's nobody that's really building trails, making sure that they're not degrading the state trust land. There is a grazing lessee in there, and sometimes there's conflict between the mountain bike trail users versus the grazing lessees. And we had talked with state parks about, could you maybe lease the surface from us and kind of manage what's going on with the mountain bike trails, including building trails and making sure that things are safe. But also when the grazing lessee wants to come in there and graze, close down the parking lot and the facilities so that we don't have people in there bothering the grazing lessee and what he's trying to do. Unfortunately, that legislation didn't come to fruition, and so our experiment was dead in the water, if you will. Additionally, other states are looking at monetizing recreation, and we ourselves have been looking at that. And we see that as another way to generate revenue, but it's complicated. We've looked at Montana, and I believe Montana has kind of a permit that they sell that you can go online and get that kind of covers you for all recreating on state trust lands. And perhaps Deputy Director Crowder can talk more about it. So we've looked at that. Our problem is we don't really have enforcement authority. So when we look for enforcement on state lands, we look to Game and Fish to help out, or state parks, or the sheriff, or something like that. So we're unsure about details about what that would look like, but certainly want to have the opportunity to be able to explore that and to monetize recreation on state lands. Another issue that we faced is public perception directing land management decisions. We still have a perception out there with the public that state lands are equivalent to public lands, to federal public lands. A lot of times people don't understand that state trust lands are just that. They're a trust asset, and we're concerned about revenue and generating revenue for those uses. But nevertheless, there are, a lot of outdoorsmen, hunters, fishermen, that sort of thing that like to recreate on them. We've seen in some of our exchanges and opportunities where the Board of Land Commissioners is looking at the pros and cons of whether to do a land exchange. They've received a lot of pressure from the outdoorsmen to maintain access for hunting and fishing purposes, and sort of this notion of the financial opportunity for the trust beneficiaries, it gets lost in the shuffle and it becomes very political. So we're concerned about that. And then finally, we don't have a lot of staff, if you will, to pursue some of these different endeavors that we haven't done before. Right now, in our trust land management division and including our field services that inspects and does a lot of things that way, we only have about 25 people. We have one person program managers, we have one person who's doing commercial leasing, one person who's doing the real estate transactions, we have one person doing the temporary use permitting. So it makes it difficult to be proactive and go out there and look for those great commercial revenue generating opportunities. So it's our hope that once we clear some of these barriers that I think it was New Mexico and maybe Montana had divisions of their departments that deal with proactive revenue generation, commercial development. We'd love to be able to have something like that where we could be more proactive. Our history shows us that with the legislation that they passed a couple years ago directed at Teton County, where we were able to go out there and proactively have, a request for proposals and things like that. It really did result in significant additional revenue generation for that parcel. Now, not everybody liked it. We certainly didn't target Teton County. The legislature told us to go to Teton County, and so we did the best we could. But we think that having the ability to be a little more proactive, whether it's Laramie County, those parcels that are near Cheyenne, whether it's parcels near Gillette, near Laramie, whatever, that those could, we could have some success, we think, putting out RFPs, especially for more commercial type development there. Our newer revenue generation efforts that we've been making, again, we're always looking for new and different ways to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons we're here, is we don't always have the authority to do the things that we would like to do. We are seeing an uptick in renewables, solar in particular, wind, pore space leasing and carbon capture leasing. That's kind of our newest endeavor. The board has approved 2 pore space leases. We're sort of on the front end of that, or the cutting edge of that, because I don't think many people have figured out how to value pore space. And so we're kind of wading into the deep end, but sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. So we've done that there just to push forward with that endeavor.
Go ahead and finish your thought on that pore space, and then we'll get to your question.
That's all I just wanted to.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, so pore space is something that the legislature created by statutorily in 2013-14, and basically recognizes that there are places, voids in the earth where you can actually store materials. So CO2 being the one that I'm sure we're talking about in the context of this conversation, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So they could be either caverns, salt cavern type big voids, or they could be diffuse pore space, over things. So the same way we extract things from underground, we were talking about taking that same void and putting it, or putting something in it, or a void and putting something in it, whether it be a diffuse void or a open void. And the way the statute was created, and it was Speaker Lubno was in the office at that time, was the surface owner is the initial owner of that pore space. It can subsequently be severed, just like minerals can be severed from the surface. But the reason that they're dealing with this is because they're the surface owner, so they automatically also, the way the statute was enacted, own the pore space. And so they have a lease ability to that. If that wasn't an adequate summary, please correct me. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that was a terrific summary. Mr. Chairman, with that, I would like to yield to Deputy Director Crowder to give a little more detail on some of our current revenue generation efforts, including the Teton County effort that's been very political and in the newspapers, and I'd like for him to provide some color on that, please.
Thank you. Mr. Crowder, you can go ahead, but it has not been in my local newspaper, so go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to note that the office does have a fiduciary responsibility, and it does take that seriously. And it takes that from the legislative guidance as well. The legislature says in statute that the office has a fiduciary responsibility. And we in the office and the staff that the director and I work with take that mission very seriously. And when we compare that mission to who it benefits, which is the beneficiaries and largely the K through 12 school system, that becomes an even more passionate mission to follow. And so the staff that we have in office are extremely motivated to do a good job in this arena. And I make that statement because we are given the guidance through the Board of Land Commissioners rules and regulations, as well as the guidance through statute, to do certain things. But they know that those are limiting things and those aren't everything. And that there are other opportunities that they can find that will generate more revenue and maybe outside the bounds of what the statutes and the rules have created. And so they're always looking for that. We're always trying to have those conversations and communication streams with local communities in finding where markets are at and exploiting those markets as much as possible. And we have parcels that are strategically placed across the whole state. Whoever came up with the shotgun pattern of section 16 and 36 knew exactly how to generate revenue. That's being very facetious, but we do use what we have and the assets that the state holds. We try to exploit and optimize as much as possible. The other thing that our office tries to do is kind of meet in the middle between two terms. One is maximize, the other is optimize. There's not a lot of great guidance for us as far as what we do in the office and how we move forward, but the term that we like the most is optimize because it utilizes the most collaborative situations as much as possible. It tries to have one asset bring more than one revenue stream in as much as possible, but it doesn't just chase the highest dollar. We have been here as a trust, as a management agency for your state trust lands for 133 years and want to do that for another 133 years. So that doesn't mean what is the biggest bang for your buck tomorrow, but what has the most sustainable features tied to it for the greatest benefit for those beneficiaries. The director mentioned some communities around the state that we are actively looking at. Teton County was given to us by the legislature, and we appreciate that, and it's the gift that keeps giving, and thank you for that again. But it is a place that we have known for quite some time has a lot of benefit to the beneficiaries that we were not tapping into. So prior to the legislative directive, we've known that the parcel on next to Teton Village, the Highway 390 parcel, exhibited some attributes that could be monetized and possibly weren't being addressed to their greatest extent. So we started a process long before the legislature gave us that direction to try to bring those uses on that parcel up to market rates, including the grazing lease. That grazing lease was it followed its normal course as grazing leases do, and then was transitioned into a temporary use permit because there might have been something that parcel could have benefited the beneficiaries with, either through an exchange, through a sale, or some other long-term commercial lease. Those talks were held long before my time. They never went anywhere. In fact, they had some policy implications as far as development across the rest of the state, and eventually those conversations cooled. We brought that grazing lease back in a competitive sense and had it bid upon so that it would generate a market rate for the area. Fortunately, unfortunately, only one bidder showed up to the auction, and that's who currently holds the lease. But they pay a fair price for that based on its exposure to the market. We took that same premise, and the existing industrial uses on that parcel were put in the same type of process. They were given, let me back up. We understood that they were not returning market rates. We did an appraisal of the properties, understood that there could be a higher market rate available for those parcels, and that the most appropriate market rate was only going to be derived if we could present those sites, those tracts, or those use types to the open market. But we had to do that incrementally. We couldn't just expose those permittees to a brand new rate that they were not ready for, that they didn't budget for. So we did an appraisal, moved them to a market rate over a period of 3 years with the understanding that at the end of the term of that permit, we were going to expose them to the open market. As the director mentioned, staffing always plays a key role in any of these. And when we were expecting to do that in 2017, 2018, we didn't have the staffing to complete that effort. And it wasn't until recently and timely enough when the legislature gave us the direction to look at Teton County that we were staffed at to the ability to do that effort. We did it. We did it through a solicitation of proposals. And as the PowerPoint shows, we were able to select very good, forward-thinking, higher revenue generating, higher benefit to the beneficiary type use cases to present to the board for consideration for approval. That's a great model to follow, and we expect to move to continue to follow that model. We have a parcel up on Casper Mountain that currently has a restaurant. It has some cabin sites on it, but it can utilize or be benefited by other attention given on, can we expand the restaurant use case up in that area? Can we expand the cabin site use case in that area? Can we do something completely different? But it obviously sits in an area that has great market demand and very low risk as far as placing commercial uses on the property that may disappear in a week or two. So good sustainability, as I mentioned before. So those are the types of things that we're looking at internally to the office. Some of those are limited by statutes and legislative directive and board directive, frankly, as the director mentioned, and some are not, and they're just simply limited by the amount of time and staff capacity we have in the office to pursue them.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Crowder or the director? Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the things that you mentioned, Director, was you have identified some areas, Laramie County being one. Are there other areas that you know of that are, kind of sitting up there with just that little hint of glimmer that said, hey, look, these are relatively good opportunities for you guys to be looking at, and we haven't given the go-ahead yet on that we could do? Of course, Teton County was great, and we all recognized that we were going to be making more money off of that than a grazing lease. Is there stuff around here, like you just said, Cheyenne? I'm thinking Natrona, I'm thinking Gillette, those types of situations. Are there other areas right now that we could be maximizing revenue on that we just haven't done yet? And if so, what's holding that back?
Director, please.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Brown, yes, of course, we've looked at various parcels, some very strategically placed. Some are parts of potential exchanges. Some are parcels that are sitting there that we think would be optimal. Don't want to give that out and sort of have people steal our secrets. Just kidding. But anyway, I think some of it has been, some of these would be conducive to more of a request for proposal type process that the deputy was talking about. And we are limited by staff and our ability to do that. However, we have been working to staff up, and we are getting some people into key positions, and we hope to be able to pursue that. And as the deputy said, some of those we don't believe would require, a change in legislation, at least with what we know now. Now, there may be some opportunities that would require that, and we just don't know that yet.
Senator Guru, and then Representative Altman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Director, Deputy Director. How are you? Appreciate you being here. Just have a couple of questions. Talk about fiduciary responsibility. Could you expand on that just a little bit exactly in all your state lands? What, just as far as the office view of that? Just talk a little bit about that. I just kind of want to get a better handle on what you're talking about.
Go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, I think when we talk about fiduciary duty, it's the typical definition of a fiduciary in that role. We're not only looking for revenue generation to help with K through 12 education, or if it's an institution, helping with support for that institution, but it's not just about the money. We're also looking at the trust asset is supposed to be intergenerational. So we need to make sure that we're taking steps to preserve that trust asset over time, that we're not allowing degradation to come to that trust asset. And so sometimes, in our opinion, there may be bad actors out there that we don't want to lease to. It's not always going to be about chasing the dollar, but it's the best overall interests of the trust beneficiaries.
I can follow up.
Thank you. Follow-ups?
Thanks, and that helps a lot, because then Deputy Director Crowder was just, when he was talking about his view on that, he was talking about lands that we could exploit. Now, talk about exploit and fiduciary and how those two work. Because you use that word, and I'm just trying to figure out the context of what you meant.
Go ahead, whoever, I guess,
The Deputy
Deputy
Director
Crowder,
Crowder.
thank you.
Yes.
Please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Senator Drew, I think that each parcel is an asset owned by the state for the benefit of the beneficiaries. Each one of those, each one of those assets has its ability to return that benefit. Perhaps I used the wrong word when I used the word exploit, but we want that asset to perform to its optimal level. And if that means utilizing it for commercial development rather than grazing, just because of the revenue stream differences there, then that would be what my use of the word exploit was intended to mean, is that we want that asset to return its optimal level of performance.
If I
Okay,
can-
thank you, go ahead,
Okay,
follow up.
that helps a lot now. Just take that part right there where that helps, because, so now if you've got a grazing, and just to use your example, you've got a grazing use here, and now a higher and better use in your fiduciary responsibility would be a commercial use. Doesn't matter where, but then that, based on your fiduciary responsibility, that's kind of more a guiding principle then that you all would follow. True or false?
Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, I don't know if it's as simple as that, because the whole state is vastly different as far as the lands that we manage. So it's very hard to answer that. But what I will say is when we're working towards normalizing the revenue stream from state trust lands, from a giant like oil and gas, and then a very large box like leasing, there's a lot of components that are tied to that. But the exact same principle would be placed on each parcel as well. And so when I also stated that we'd like to combine or have as many revenue generating streams from one asset, from one parcel as possible, we look at that as well. So when we talk about the highest and best use for commercial development, that might be right on 40 acres. The rest of the 640 acres might be right for grazing to be continued there. But you are kind of hedging what would be a revenue stream on a year-to-year basis back to the beneficiaries and ensuring that that asset, that parcel, is always returning something. The commercial tenant may come and go, the lease rates may come and go. The same may be true of the grazing income, or if it's a recreational lease or anything else that might come off of that parcel. But when you have more than one use on it, you're trying to generate the optimal performance from that parcel and hedging against the ebbs and flows of each individual industry.
Thank you. I'm assured this is not Appropriations Committee. Senator Guru.
Actually, no, thank you,
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman. I'm really trying, this is helpful. I'm just trying to get a picture here because, and I'm going to get to the main point in a minute, and I'm just trying to get around to getting a whole flavor of the deal. Where we're going with this from what you've said to me today. Casper Mountain, you were talking about Casper Mountain. So, and we just a minute ago, we talked about a grazing use and a commercial use may come that may be better, and that's something you might look at depending on the site. Got it. Casper Mountain today, small food service operation, a couple of cabins. I think maybe there's room for expansion, or as you said, maybe an entirely other use entirely, maybe a hotel, maybe something, or an inn of some sort. Would that be something that you would contemplate as possibly a higher and better use on that parcel? Is that what you were kind of?
That is 4 questions now. I'm just in that statement and question. So go ahead. You only have to answer one of them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru. I don't believe I used the word hotel. What I would like to say is that that parcel exhibits attributes that we're not totally tapping into yet. And who knows what they are until we reach into the market and understand what the market could bear. If it's a hotel, that's fantastic, and we'll work down that road. If it's 3 more cabins, that's fantastic, and we'll work down that road. So that's the one question I was picking to answer.
If you want to go to someone else, I can come back.
We're going to someone else, yes. I think Representative Altman, you were next. Did you have something? No? Yes, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing out the point that fiduciary responsibility is the main thing that guides it. I mean, that's like your mission. So I appreciate that. To not really to repeat what Senator Guru was saying, but just points of clarification so I kind of understand this, because you hear a lot of different possibilities. First off, to keep in mind multiple use. I hear that that is definitely in the works. I mean, if it can be grazing along with something else, as we have seen grazing and extractive industry and stuff like that. Okay. If you would please explain to me, just for information, how exchanges work, but also how a 99-year lease would work. Is that something to do in lieu of actually selling? Because we don't do that. Would that be that? And also, if it's commercial, at the end of that lease, depending on what it is, how is it taken care of? I mean, if it was a successful venture, maybe it would be recontracted or released. If not, where is the reclamation and how does that work?
Thank you. She got all of her questions in one setting, so if you weren't taking notes, I'm sorry. So go ahead, proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ottman, with respect to the coexisting uses, yes, that's always the way we prefer. If we can have grazing along with perhaps oil and gas facilities, things like that, obviously those are layer upon layer, if you will, of additional revenue for the trust beneficiaries. The 99-year lease, we're thinking of that mainly in terms of residential, because we're trying to maintain an income stream, if you will, to the trust beneficiary. So that could be done residential, where somebody might want to build a house or a cabin, have a 9-year lease term on it, or it could be commercial development. Now, depending upon the type of commercial development, we may require bonding, but in any event, if in fact after the term of their lease is up, they need to reclaim the property to as closely to where it was when they first took on the lease, so that the asset is made whole, if you will. And it may take some time, for shrubs and trees and things to grow, but there's generally a reclamation requirement, and on a lot of different types of activity, we require bonding in the event that they fall through with that. With respect to the exchange process, it's a little complicated, but I'll just give you kind of a high level. With the exchange process, a person who might be interested in an exchange with the state, they'll come into the office, and we initially have some discussions. We don't ask people to put in an application right away. Most people want to come and talk to see if there's even a deal that can be had before they go through, appraisals and all of those sorts of things. So they'll come in, we'll have a conversation with them. We have our own folks do an initial kind of look at it and see, is this something that we might be interested in? When we're dealing with exchanges, we're again looking to put the trust beneficiaries in a better position than where they currently are. So is there a reason for the exchange? Meaning, is there does this parcel that they want to trade out, does it have access to, like gas and water and all those things? Are they on a major highway or something where it's of benefit for us to trade out of a more isolated parcel to get that access and to get that opportunity to bring in gas and water and all the things that you would need for a commercial development? So we look at all those things to see if there's something in it for the trust beneficiaries. We generally don't exchange just to exchange, because we have to spend our resources on that. And so then if we decide that, hey, we're interested in this, they can fill out an application. That remains confidential until it gets through a certain point in our process. Because again, we don't want third parties to get in there and try to steal the deal, if you will, or to say, well, the state moves like the Titanic, they can't move very fast, so we'll do a deal with you right here, right now, just to help you out. So, again, then there's a time after the initial discussions, our staff brings it to me as the director, and we call that the Category 2 list. And I decide, is this something that we're interested in, that we want to take to the Board of Land Commissioners for consideration? If we decide to do that, we go into executive session with the board looks at it, and if they decide that they would like to move forward with that, they come out of executive session. At the next board meeting, they take action on it, and they direct us to continue on with our process, which means, appraisals, the public comment period, where folks can comment. We have to give notice to the county commissioners, and now that with the new legislation, we have to provide notice to the surrounding landowners. Then after all the comments are taken, and we bring it back to the board, and the board decides whether or not they direct us to move forward with that. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, and I know I'm kind of high level, and Jason's probably cringing over here because I'm not using all the right terms, but that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. I had Representative Knapp next, and then I'll come this way. Representative Knapp, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I may make him cringe some more here. So, my question has to deal with the future. As we look at state lands as an investment, both to optimize and maximize, how far out do we go? We've all heard of the federal government's 30 by 30, where they are trying to get additional land in states, roughly about the size of Texas. And with the BLM ruling to lease possibly to conservative conservation, I misspoke, conservation districts, which most are now run or donated to by Bill Gates Foundation, Soros Foundation, things like that. What are you doing in the office, or do you need more tools in the office to not only maximize the land that we have, but as private ranches come on sale, that will maximize either minerals, since we're at 81% with oil and I think 12% with other minerals, or access, or just places where it makes sense to be able to in the future trade with the federal government, say land in Teton for mineral rights or land in Teton for access. Is the department taking any look at that for the future? And if so, what tools would you need from legislature in order to do that?
Thank you. And you had several questions in there, but I will comment on one thing. I don't think you meant to say conservation districts. I think you meant to say conservation uses as a use, not conservation districts, which is a particular type of district in Wyoming that I don't want anybody out in the 752 people who are not listening today to go, what's going on with conservation districts? Mr. Crowder, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp. It's a good question and not one with a good answer, because each parcel is different, like we've already talked about. And so looking out into the future on each one would be difficult, because they're all going to demand different attribute analysis and things like that. What we do know is that we want to be sustainable in whatever decisions we make today. And as the director mentioned in the exchange process, sometimes that's what's happening this year. Sometimes that's what's happening in the next 50 to 100 years. Are we repositioning in a spot that would take an advantage of anything that might come in that period of time? So it's hard to give you an answer of how far out we're looking. It depends on the parcel that we're talking about. We also struggle with this sense of development, full development, mostly in the extractive industries, oil and gas, mostly, versus conservation measures. And we see this in the Red Desert a lot, in the federally designated areas like ACECs or wilderness study areas. We're a little bit limited, or we have a little conflict that we have to work through when we're trying to develop those extractive industries in those areas. And we try to come to a meet in the middle, and sometimes that's not, we can't find it. But we do have our fiduciary responsibility, and we don't have a responsibility for conservation. And that sustainable, well, let me restate that in a different way. The oil and gas industry has done great things to be able to develop and do their business in a sustainable way. And we very much work in a partnership with them to do that. The Board of Land Commissioners can place stipulations on those leases to help protect some of those important attributes, such as habitat, or if there's some cultural thing that we can work around. We are starting to have a better relationship now, rather than a direct conflict, with some of the conservation groups around the state to say, yes, we can do both of these things at the same time. And the technology that those extractive industries are using now allow us to do that. We've come up with a talking point, and it's probably going to develop into a program sometime in the future as we move forward. And it's through these conversations with the conservation groups that we've been having, that if you want us to recognize some conservation measure that's important to you, you'll have to create a benefit back to the beneficiary for that. And mostly the time, that's a compensation structure. Does it remove those lands from production, from oil and gas, as an example? Not at all. But it works with the oil and gas industry to fully exploit, I'll use that term again, fully exploit the technology that the oil and gas industry, for example, has developed, such as directional drilling and the very long lateral legs that we're seeing. Can we put the actual surface location in an area that's not sensitive for habitat, or not in an area of cultural concern, but still drill for the minerals underneath? And we've been working in that area, or in that way, and that's been positive. The next step is, you use the word conservation leasing. Can we monetize that through a conservation lease? Can we put not a total restriction on development, but some type of regimented or ladder type restriction based on the compensation and the important cultural resource or habitat that needs to be protected? We're still working through that. As the director mentioned, it's very similar to pore space leasing. There's not a great compensation package or a market to draw from to say what a good lease rate would be in that area, but that's a way we're working.
Thank you very much. Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couple questions here, just kind of maybe help me understand a little bit of some other things that I hear in my area from my constituents. Is how many actual acres does the state of Wyoming own in trust? And second question would be, how many of those acres are isolated or landlocked that do not have public access currently, that are not really accessible to the public? Because the reason I ask that is because there's a lot of discussion. I've heard it in multiple meetings and town halls where we want access to those state lands. We want to be able to get to them. They're ours. We have the right to go and travel on them, hunt on them, camp on them, and everything like that. In this effort to try to create and generate more revenue, what do you guys see from your office's standpoint about what the future lies for those isolated parcels? And I mean, we've tried to pass worked on some legislation here in the past on being able to do some transfers. And, if you've got public access to a small piece of land, just full disclosure, I have 2 pieces of state land that we lease from you guys, have since I can remember. And even the previous landowners leased those same lands. One of them is 80 acres, 79 point some acres. And to add insult to injury, there's public access through that. And so I've got an extremely small parcel of land that you can shoot across with a rifle, unfenced, with public access. How do you see the use? And I've also got a school section we lease that is completely isolated. I mean, it would require access, public access from one direction of 4 separate landowners to provide public access to that chunk of ground. So I guess my question is, as we're looking for ways to try to generate more revenue, right now, that's the surface lease and timber. There's really all that there is on these 2 pieces of land. What do you see coming for those issues where we have a consistently growing desire on the part of the public to access those inaccessible pieces of ground? How can we look at trying not to create a train wreck from the perspective of the adjacent landowners and still do our fiduciary responsibility to provide additional dollars to the state for their lands? What do you see as a state office in looking at those situations right now? As a growing concern in my part of the country is access to landlocked state lands. So if you could speak to that just briefly, I would sure appreciate it.
So I'll perhaps a little bit, in the presentation is the gross number of acres, 3.4, 3.9 land and minerals. As far as isolated acres or non-public accessible acres, that's something that's not in the presentation. The other thing I think is maybe talk a little bit about the multiple use versus trust land issue as well, because that is something that, I mean, I think we also have to consider as policymakers, that some people think that our lands should be managed the same as some federal surfaces, and I think we do have there's a discussion to be had about that. I'm not saying one side or the other, but Director or Deputy Director, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Nyman, I'm not sure how many acres we have that are isolated. Do you have that number, Jason?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Nyman, everybody in the office is going to laugh at me, but I don't remember that off the top of my head. We have done a lot of work on that. Yeah. Right, because this is a question that comes up often. We've done work on that. We have that data in our office, and we can get that to you.
There was more in that, so go ahead, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when we take action on state lands, we always look to our trust land management objectives. And as part of those objectives, the board has to look at various aspects that they have prioritized. You know, is this transaction, be it an exchange, disposal, whatever, is it going to generate more revenue? Is some disposal or exchange of this parcel, is it going to make it easier to manage? But access and hunting are like the lowest priority with respect to decision-making on how to either exchange or dispose of or lease those parcels. And so I think that there's a lot of confusion with respect to, with the federal, multiple use sustained yield, they're looking at doing all of those things. But when you're managing a trust asset, as we mentioned, we're interested in the revenue and in protection, long-term protection of the asset. That doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for the board to take action to help block up parcels that make it easier for hunting and fishing and that sort of thing. And we do have walk-in areas with game and fish where we have done that, but that's not the top priority. Usually there's a revenue component to it, or is this going to provide a community good, such as building a new school or something like that. With respect to what is our plan for isolated parcels, we've talked a lot about that, I think, over the last couple of years, as there has been legislation drafted where I think the hope was to prioritize some sort of disposal or sale or exchange of those isolated parcels. We do in our rules have an expedited exchange process for those isolated parcels where you don't have to go to all the great lengths of a disposal or an exchange. It doesn't require a bona fide appraisal. It's a market analysis and things like that that makes it a little easier. Jason, what else am I missing with respect to the isolated parcels?
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know, Director, that you're missing too much. It's just a very broad question, once again, across the whole state. There are isolated parcels across the whole state. One of your last questions was the defined multiple use. And I think that kind of plays into this just a little bit. Obviously, the federal government has a management mandate of multiple use and sustained yield. We borrow the term multiple use, but we use it in a different way, I guess. And that is mostly benefit to the beneficiary driven. How can we create more multiple revenue streams, as we've mentioned before, from that one asset, from that one parcel? We're doing that as the office. The Board of Land Commissioners has directed that and has sole management authority to do that from the statutes and from the Constitution. But we're limited in our staffing capacity to be able to be extremely active on each parcel. And so we really rely on the surrounding landowners, and mostly those would be the grazing lessees, to help us manage the public, to help us manage the revenue streams, and to keep an asset that is continuing to appreciate and hopefully beating inflationary pressures from an investment standpoint. So your question, Representative Nyman, is a fantastic one. we balance this line every day of trying to derive the most optimal benefit to the beneficiaries while exploiting, I'll use that word again, the user, and mostly that's the grazing user and the surrounding landowners, to leverage their boots on the ground for our benefit, and trying to promote their uses and their livelihood where they live at the same time as generating that beneficiary benefit. And I think one of the best arbiters of that balance is the Board of Land Commissioners. We have a very direct fiduciary mandate. The word fiduciary has a very strong definition, but the Board of Land Commissioners bring that common sense position to our management on the ground as well. And we leverage that often, and we provide them with opportunities to make good common sense decisions as well.
Yes, please, Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I attended a meeting with the BLM in my area here just recently, and we did talk this very discussion. They're wanting to do a new study on what the values of these properties are. It hasn't been done, I don't know, 2 decades or more, 30 years maybe. The discussion that was kind of concerning is the fact that we have what Representative Knapp discussed as conservation, conservative, what would you call them? Now I'm using your word and it's wrong. Conservation groups that are coming in and wanting to be able to bid on these leases and to be able to assess that as a use. And so when you're talking about folks that have, many times unlimited resources and being able to basically quiet land, for lack of a better, term, or be able to utilize those lands, look at as a value, so we're going to use that for carbon storage. So many trees per acre, so much grassland per acre when unused creates this much ability for carbon to be stored in the plant mass. We can create value out of that and not impair it. The question that I never could get answered was, has there been any consideration to the taking or the stalling or the quieting of the land to the financial impacts of the communities where that land is stalled? For example, you quit grazing cattle on that thing, or you quit making hay on it, you quit buying fencing supplies, you quit buying fuel, you quit buying, net wrap, and you quit buying grease, and you quit employing people to go do this in the local communities, and the financial impacts long-term on local communities, where we can come in and we can pay you a lot of money to idle land, but it doesn't generate any real revenue to the local communities. So then the communities are asking, well, we need some help from the state now because we're not generating the revenue we were before because we were using the land. Is that a consideration that you guys are taking into the account when you look at value and the fiduciary responsibility, not just to generate more money with that acre, but the long-term implications and the impacts financially to the community on every acre that land touches and what it generates into the local economies? Is that something that you're taking into your equation when you're calculating these values?
Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Nyman, I believe we are. I mean, we've heard the message, particularly in Teton County, that there are people who are interested in paying, if you will, for conservation, for the view shed and other things that they like about those parcels. The problem that we have is we can't do like a conservation easement for all time and memorial, but we're looking into whether or not it's possible to do conservation leasing, so for a term, a time period, but also we don't want to do it. There's a balance, right? Because in our fiduciary duty, we also have to look at revenue, long-term revenue and sustainability and all those things. So you don't want to be able to let it for conservation purposes for such a term that you might miss a commercial opportunity. Not that you would always take that commercial opportunity, but you have to provide opportunities for other types of revenue generation. Now, that doesn't mean that, okay, let's lease it for conservation, and then in a year, we'll let somebody come in there and, start developing it. No, we're trying to figure out what the balance is. We just haven't had the staff time to get in there and to really figure out what a conservation lease should look like. But we're certainly looking at that, trying to figure out what's right for the different communities. Not every community wants conservation leasing. And in fact, if we do that and say we're going to do that, we're going to hear a lot of negative public comments about it. But there are other opportunities in Teton County that we're hearing where people would love to pay money for that. So it's about balancing, it's about understanding the local communities, the local counties, and understanding where their values are too. So we're trying to be responsive to that.
Thank you. Any further questions? Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you. I really appreciate those last comments about, some other avenues and other ideas. And just to pick back up on the points I was making about, when we talked about the grazing lease and we talked about Casper Mountain. And I know, I'm sorry, I not to put words in your mouth. I know you didn't say hotel. You said more, other uses, something bigger, I don't know what that could be. Now let's get to Teton County. And the 390 parcels, since that's what's brought up in your presentation and in the presentation from the staff. A lot of people feel that the value of that land is increased because of its proximity to a national park. I would submit to you that the Tetons have been there for thousands of years, Yellowstone and all that's been there for a long time. The value of that land's increase has been a recent phenomenon, a phenomenon brought about by a concerted effort of the people in the community to build the value of that land through various means, through various sacrifices, just like the folks on Casper Mountain, just like the folks who are grazing their land. From a customer service standpoint, there's a process that we've been through in the last year with Teton County. I think you'd agree has been uneven at best. Is that a fair statement? As far as
If you care to respond, you can. If you have more to add, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, my point is, from a customer service standpoint moving forward, and I hear you now talking, do you think that there might have been some other ways we could have done it to try to achieve the goal that is your fiduciary responsibility? And exploit's a fine word for me. I have no problem with it. I didn't mean it in a bad connotation. To try to elevate and try to make the best possible return. From a customer service standpoint, from your organization to the public that we both serve, that there are better ways. And I heard you talk about some, but could you see the point of the folks that are coming at you from the anti side now, that it just hasn't worked as well? And I'm trying to get at, like I say, from a customer service standpoint, because I think it's going to continue to happen to us if we don't pick up on that.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, I'm not exactly sure where you're headed with the customer service standpoint, because yes, we do know that there are some people in Teton County that are not happy with the decisions by the Board of Land Commissioners to issue those temporary use permits. But we also know of people in the county who are happy with it, who are anxious to take advantage of those services, be it the storage facility or the glamping facility. So I guess I'm not sure I agree with your premise, because I think there's a middle ground here, and I think we've been trying to provide opportunities for entrepreneurs who are wanting to have more opportunities in Teton County, but also trying to be sensitive to the Teton County residents with respect to the permitting processes and all of that. So.
Okay, further, anything else from the committee? Yes, Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, unrelated necessarily to your daily jobs, but more related to ours. And the purpose of this committee, very important conversation we've had here this afternoon. But typically, what legislative committee do you report to?
Depends on the issue, but go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, our General Oversight Committee is the Joint Ag Committee.
And in the past 2 years, what legislative committees have you testified in front of?
Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, I believe the Revenue Committee, Joint Appropriations. What else am I missing? Education, yes.
And the Agricultural Committee?
Yes,
Chairman?
excuse me.
Please,
Yes,
yes.
Mr. Chairman.
And then, Mr. Chairman, as an additional follow-up,
Please.
this doesn't work with my style of questioning that I'm trying to do. You actually report ultimately to the Board of Land Commissioners, the SLIB board, the 5 statewide electeds, correct?
Mr.
Correct.
Chairman, Senator Nethercott, yes, we are their administrative arm.
Okay. Further?
Nope, thanks.
Thank you. Anything further? So I have a couple, we've had a lot of interesting conversations, and I think that, and thank you for the obstacle 5 bullet points. And I think maybe if you think there's a prioritization in those that you'd like this committee to take up, let's have that. And if something else has come up in the discussion or that has come to mind that wasn't included in this presentation as far as these obstacles, and you think we should take that up, then, or look, maybe do some research to see how other people or other states are addressing particular issues, we'd be glad to work with you and advance that. But I have a couple of questions. One, it seems like we talked about the RFP process for these particular higher value, let's say, parcels. Is that the RFP process is something you are using as a in absence of a nomination process? And in fact, in the absence of them saying we want to do something, you're saying here's something we're offering for these purposes or these broader purposes. We want to focus on this. Is that kind of one thing we're talking about here? The difference between nomination from interested users to you saying, no, pay attention. This is something we think there's a lot of opportunity here. Is that kind of maybe not a change, but a focus difference that we're part of this RFP? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we do still have people that come to us and nominate parcels for exchange and that sort of thing. This would be in addition to, not in lieu of. I mean, obviously, we do have limited staff, but we're hopeful that we can identify parcels and use our resources on those that we think are going to be the biggest bang for the buck, if you will, which would be a new way of doing business. OSLI has often been criticized for waiting for the opportunities to come to them. We would like to be a little more proactive and see if that helps make a difference with respect to the revenue we're able to generate.
Thank you. So on that note, you used the next term I was going to ask about. Proactive revenue generation was a term I heard somebody use in the presentation. Is that something that can be done, or is it being done elsewhere on a contract basis, where you let a contract to a large firm that goes out and you say, I want these 5 parcels, go out and let's solicit interest in these things? Because there are obviously a lot of interest in Western lands, and a lot of organizations or realty companies, et cetera, from around the world are in this market. So is that something you've looked at? I mean, you're talking about everything in-house and you have a very small house. So my point is there a way to actually extend your reach by using some kind of contract services? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that we've investigated that specifically, but certainly that would be a way to help us overcome. Deputy Crowder obviously has a different view here, but I mean, we have for federal exchanges, correct? We've hired a consultant for that, but not, as far as I know, for this specific type of revenue generation where we've gone out and looked and said, let's focus on that. Jason, if I'm wrong,
Yep,
Mr.
Deputy
Chairman.
Crowder, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Mr. Chairman, the only addition to that is when the legislature passed the act in 2020 to have us look at commercial opportunities in Teton County, it gave us funding for a contractor, and we used other terms, but did search far and wide and even internationally on the opportunities that could exist in Teton County. That was right at the time when budgets were slashed, and we let go of some of that funding and did that work in-house instead of hiring the consultant at that time. The only addition to what the director mentioned was in our oil and gas leasing program, we do use a company that offers us an online platform to sell our leases, and they do a great job of advertising every single oil and gas lease that we have for bid, and we have 3 leases each year. It's roughly 600 parcels, and we've seen extreme benefit from that from a revenue standpoint, just getting that broader market exposure and receiving those additional bonuses from that auction.
Thank you. I've got a list of questions too.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So corner crossing, we talked a little bit about public access and those type of things. So and we just had a court case decided on some issues. So are you having any of those with state lands? And I know you have a section 16 and 36, but oftentimes they are abutted to or cornered to federal lands or other lands. So are you seeing any of those type of questions? And I say that because in my community, what we have is school sections that lie along interstate highways, and people walk the fence from federal right-of-way to state lands, and then they corner cross or geolocate all over the countryside. So are you getting any of those issues as part of what you're hearing from lessees or the surrounding landowners, adjacent private landowners? Go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that I'm aware of any specific instances. Now, I'm sure there probably are some situations out there where things are ongoing and they just haven't reported to us, but I'm not aware of anything specifically. Are you, Deputy?
Go ahead, Jason, if you are.
Mr. Chairman, not specifically, but when hunting season rolls around, we love to answer hunting calls and where am I calls. And those are coming, and I'm sure this topic will come up in that. I also think that the case you're referring to involved a corner of two pieces of state land, so we could use that as an example.
Right, okay, thank you. All right, any further questions? One more question, Senator Garou.
Thanks. Thank you.
About Campbell County.
Yeah, as a matter of fact. No, it's actually something that the deputy director just said. I just want to go back. He said, you go into an area and talk about hiring professionals to come in and talk about the use of land. I wonder going forward, whether it be in Campbell County or wherever, Casper Mountain or any of these places, or maybe even Teton County, who knows, that you engage local people on the ground who may have particular knowledge, and that too as part of the toolkit that we put together to do that. Could you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely.
Director or Deputy Director?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a very good point, because what we want to do is something that's sustainable again, and what the market can withstand and what the market demands be responsive to it. The people who know that best are usually the local folks, and so we try to develop relationships as much as we can with those local planning offices with each county to understand, or have them understand that the blue squares on the map could be used, and to just don't overlook them as open space, but to come and have a conversation with us. And not only that, and this is a great segue, so I'm going to use it, but I was able to attend a meeting with Senator Nethercott a year or so ago about lands here in Cheyenne, about trying to find a way to create an affordable housing scenario and how this office could play a role in that. We don't know that unless we're able to talk with those locals and see how we can be a partner at the table and be beneficial, not only to the community, but to the beneficiaries at the same time. And that doesn't always mean that you have to use the land as currently owned. You can do something that's dynamic, that's new and out of the box.
Well, Jim.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yeah. Thank you very much for answering the question, and I'm more than happy to give you a segue anytime I can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A Segway, isn't that one of those two-wheeled scooter things?
Exactly.
Okay. Any further questions? I guess, any further questions from the committee? So I have one final one. We have talked about maximum, kind of the premise of this has been maximum optimal return to the beneficiaries, et cetera. And there was a question about, inaccessible lands, or at least publicly accessible lands. And my question is, and it's difficult, I mean, when you look at these maps and you see the blue squares, and I remember 25 years ago, there was a term, go blue, coal bed methane days, if some of you might remember that, but some won't. So my question is, are there lands that you actually get no value from because they're isolated within federal lands? Great, and I'm thinking of whether they be Forest Service lands, Department of Interior lands, et cetera, where because of their location, there is no return. And would those be eligible, or something where we do actually do some exchanges and blocking, et cetera, with federal partners or whoever they may be? And you can't look at the map and see where the Thunder Basin grasslands are or know those delineations, but I'm pretty confident that there are state school sections surrounded by Forest Service lands, grasslands, that you are beholden to the federal government. Whoever they lease to is who you have. there is no other. So are there places where we could actually maybe do some things, block up some lands, they get their ownership, we get ownership, and keep it completely, this is not private for state, or this is completely public lands and multi-purpose lands for a fiduciary or trust land, where we could actually maybe get some more value and improve management and some of the other objectives which you already have, and they have too. The BLM has disposal lists as well, and all across this state where there are lands that they would actively choose to exchange or sell or do something with. So do you have a roster of those type of lands, or could one be generated where there is no revenue, there is nothing that's coming from this because of its, location, no location? Director.
Mr. Chairman, we do have a list like that. We do realize that there are parcels that are isolated within, different federal land blocks that aren't doing much for us. And there are situations where before my time, and perhaps the deputy can speak to this, that there were efforts made to identify more of those and to figure out how to block them up, particularly with feds.
Go ahead, Deputy.
Mr. Chairman, in 2017, the Joint Ag Committee asked this question, and it asked us to identify all the lands that were trapped within wilderness study areas, ACECs, and roadless areas. And we did that. And then also, what were the revenue-generating streams off of those parcels currently, and what were potential that were being limited. We have that report. We can provide that to this committee at any time. It's dated, it's 2017. But the result of that showed about 100,000 acres, only 100,000 acres were trapped inside of those designated type situations. What it doesn't speak to is what you alluded to, is how federal management policies, specifically oil and gas development policies, are hampering our ability to develop oil and gas on state lands. And we don't have a fair assessment of that. And really, those just come up on a almost APD by APD basis to understand where we're limited. But we do have the list. It's rather short in nature because some of those 100,000 acres, or a vast majority actually of those 100,000 acres, actually do generate some type of revenue, even though they're trapped inside that designation, either from grazing, from directional drilling, as I said, but we also have a relationship with the Game and Fish Department, and we lease for habitat for forage development. We removed cattle from the range that weren't typically using it anyway and saved that forage for winter habitat. But the Game and Fish pays us a lease fee for that. The list that I spoke about is relatively small, and it's on parcels that nobody can get to, nobody wants to get to, and they don't want to waste their money paying just to say, I have that. The best example, I have three of them that come to mind. One is Fortification Creek. There is a grazing lease on that, but there is a lot of gas that is trapped under there because of the wilderness study area designation. We made a lot of effort with the BLM to try to exchange that parcel, and that effort is not dead yet, but through administration changes at the BLM and higher, that conversation is kind of cooled a bit. But that's one of our top priorities, is to exchange out of that parcel. We have another parcel on top of Carter Mountain outside of Meeteetse that you can't get to unless you pack a very large lunch. And nobody wants that. But we think that the BLM, who holds the land all the way around it, would benefit from owning it. So whenever we do get into an exchange with the BLM, that's going to be a parcel that's added to the list as part of the whole. And the third is lands that are trapped within Adobe Town. That's a very sensitive and important area. We'd like those to be protected for what they are, and for us to move our fiduciary responsibility to other parcels.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, I think there's the other end of the equation, i.e. there's that really high value, very specific places, and then there's places that nobody ever heard about, but they're there, and I think there's, whether, I don't know which one's the lower hanging fruit, but maybe there's some fruit to be borne on both of them if we have willing partners. So with that, any further questions from the committee? None. Are any of these that, I guess I'll ask the committee first. It's page 35, thank you. 35 of the state lands presentation. Director, any of these that you think this is something you would like this committee to take up, bearing in mind that one we're a 2-year committee, so unless we sunset ourselves in the next session, we will still be here next interim. And the Ag Committee can take it up, but are there any of these that we could make a recommendation? Because right now, all we're doing is making a recommendation to Management Council. We decide we want to do a bill draft, that's fine too, but we could also make a recommendation to Management Council about, this is something we're going to continue to pursue. So do any of these rise to the top for the division, for the agency, and then legislators, as you hear that, is there anything you want to pursue? Thank you. Director?
Mr. Chairman, I think the first bullet point, the statutory limitations related to commercial and residential development and compensation for improvements. We, I think, worked with the Revenue Committee, or perhaps it was Representative Harshman, I can't remember, last session to try to make some inroads in that to give us more flexibility in our long-term leasing, and also the ability for compensation for improvements that are constructed on state land. So I think that would be valuable to us to be able to move forward and be able to do more of the things that we'd like to do.
So just for the reminder to the committee, we had a bill in the past session that we passed that had to do with the ag improvements. So that's an ongoing discussion on the ag side. So there is no way for someone who does an improvement in this commercial side to receive compensation should they no longer utilize that property. Ag leases are a little unique because they are constitutionally limited to 10 years. So there is a more natural endpoint to ag leases, but that doesn't mean that the same concept wouldn't be of value here. So anyway, so thank you for that. If that's your highest priority, we don't need to go any further. Committee, any comments, any thoughts on maybe taking a look at this type of a bill for this? Yes, Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have two things, but the first would be I would throw out a motion for a bill draft to modify the lease limits from 75 years to 99 years in Wyoming Statute 365114A.
Second.
So there's a motion, a second, and a question about a bill draft to change the lease limits from 75 to 99 years. And just to be clear, this is not on agricultural leasing. This would be on the rest of the special use type leasing permits. Oh, we didn't take any public comment. Is there anybody for public comment on anything? There's a motion on the floor, but let's take some public comment before we entertain that motion. So we'll lay that on the table for the moment. I'll do that as my prerogative. My apologies. Is there anybody online while we're waiting for folks to come forward? No one online? Anybody in the audience would like to comment on just the general topic of state lands? And I think the topic is maximization of returns on valuable parcels. Representative Conrad, you have your hand raised. I apologize. Go ahead if you have something you want to bring.
Chairman Barlow, no, I just wanted to make the opportunity to visit with, or currently on the motion. I have a question on the motion. So
okay.
Yep.
Yep. So I've laid the motion back. I've laid the motion back for just a moment. So we'll take public comment. Mr. Garrett, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today every day I'm Richard Garrett, but today I'm representing the National Parks Conservation Association, and I'm grateful to be here and to participate. In fact, in all of these conversations, listening in this morning, it was very informative and educational. I always learn so much. As you consider a bill draft, I think that it might be important to realize that, as Senator Nethercott has understood, that there are places in this state that definitely need more affordable access to land for the purpose of attaining affordable housing. But it's also important, I think, as you craft a bill, to make sure that it is crafted in such a way that it recognizes that one size does not fit all. We've heard a lot of conversation from every corner, 3 of the 4 corners of the state, and we've even heard reference to the southwestern corner of the state from OSLI. So I don't have any specific language, but, as this moves forward, I think it would be worthwhile to be sure to recognize that one size does not fit all. I'd also like to say that my father used to remind me that if it was easy, anybody could do it, and OSLI has got a very difficult job. I think you've kind of grasped at least a glimpse of the tip of the iceberg that they have to grapple with. In my career, I've had the privilege to work with them in a couple of different ways that were extraordinarily rewarding to me. And this kind of goes to the point that you were trying to draw out, Mr. Chairman, on isolated parcels. In Teton County, there was such a parcel. It was a high-value parcel, actually. It was known as Antelope Flats. And it was a school parcel adjacent to Grand Teton National Park, at least on 3 sides, as I recall. Perhaps it was 4. But in any event, working with a number of conservation groups up there, we realized the opportunity to sell that land on behalf of the state's fiduciary trust obligation for a very handsome reward, I think, to that obligation. And I'm very proud of that because I think it served future generations and will serve future generations. Another example, too, is in the leaders' territory. Worked with the Office of State Lands on something called the Grand Canyon of the Black Hills. And that parcel, that property is now in the portfolio of the Office of State Lands, and it affords great opportunities for conservation, recreation, but also ongoing timbering and grazing. I'm not sure there are any minerals associated with that parcel, but in any event, I hope this gives you a sense of the complexity of the portfolio that Office of State Lands works with, and everybody's got an interest in this game, if you will. And it's not just this generation, but it's many generations going forward. So I'm grateful for the work that they do, grateful for the work that you do as well. So.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Any questions for Richard? Any questions? Seeing none, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Marguerite, you warned me you were coming with an email, so come on down. Marguerite Herman, please introduce yourself.
Red is off. Marguerite Herman, and I'm here as a long-time student, I guess our word, for school trust land. Since 2000, I got interested in them. I'm a member of a group called Advocates for School Trust Lands, which has members throughout the western states, speaking on behalf of whatever lands those states have left from when they became a state and got the school sections. Nevada, it seems, has sold off all but about 700 acres, so they're in a pickle. They're trying to get some of it back. Wyoming has, I think we've managed our lands very carefully with most of them intact, and I want to take this opportunity to compliment OSLI for the work they do, not just the skillful, professional way they do things, but they take this fiduciary duty very seriously, as Mr. Crowder mentioned when he started his testimony. When you walk in that office, you see right hand that they are hewing to the letter and the spirit of the law, and so compliments to them. They don't cut any corners. They do everything by the book, and I appreciate that. And so, at the risk of stating the obvious, we've talked about fiduciaries and trust and beneficiaries, but we haven't heard much about the beneficiary of that trust. And let me just mention that the duty of a trustee to a beneficiary is the highest duty you can possibly have. And so, as a trustee, which is state, we took the land at statehood, say, you bet we're going to manage this for the school children. That is the beneficiary. That's the only beneficiary mentioned in any documents. That is it. And it has been the practice of OSLI and the Board of Land Commissioners to say, okay, and the words are there, to inure to the benefit of the beneficiaries. Other things can be observed as well, as we've all mentioned today. the conservation, the agricultural legacy of the state, which we all value, the economic development, et cetera, hunting, fishing, but the school children are the beneficiaries. So they come first. And that's, I think we all lose kind of track of that sometimes. I will just say that, and for that reason, I've really advocated for the management of school, and also I would just appreciate, instead of people saying state lands, school trust lands is the phrase that's actually most, because there are state lands that are not trust lands, and there are trust lands that are not school trust lands. So I'll use that, the 3 sticker on that. But anyway, I really appreciated the work done by the Revenue Committee, which has no favored group. It has, no fear, no favor. They're looking for recognizing the fiduciary duty to the school children, looking beyond the traditional regular ways we have of generating money, recognizing, all the other rights and uses that we want to protect, but nevertheless, they have their eye on the rabbit, so to speak, of generating revenue, doing it responsibly, and I think other committees maybe don't maintain that single focus. And so I've appreciated that, and I appreciated this getting something. I've never been before the Management Audit Committee, so in 40 years of working with the legislature, this is a first. Usually everything's an executive session, so I really appreciate this issue finally getting raised to a very high profile, to be in front of this committee. I appreciate that tremendously. It's a great advancement from where we started 23 years ago. I'll just mention just a couple of things that were brought up today, but are longtime concerns, is the public pressure that gets brought, the competing interests, the hunters and the anglers, or just the people who like to hike and don't want things in their view shed, so to speak. And so there's a lot of public pressure that gets put on in committees and Board of Land Commissioners. Let's face it, they are 5 elected people. They're politicians. And I remember there was a case where there was a grazing lessee, and I'll try to be brief. I won't diverge much, but anyway, it was in Laramie County, and there was recreational shooting allowed on his land. And there were people would bring out old washing machines and shoot them up, and they are causing fires on his land. He couldn't go out to his truck without being in a free fire zone. It was awful. He came and said, and to OSLI, and said, please stop the recreational shooting. And the director recommended that to the Board of Land Commissioners. They would not do it because of political pressure, the recreational shooters. So let me just say that the best work done by our office here, and recognizing the obligation of fiduciary, sometimes that gets stymied at the Board of Land Commissioner level. And I will just say that sometimes the damage done, and that's just one case, it was egregious, so I thought I'd mention it. But anyway, that it undermines sometimes the very tough negotiations that our office has done to come to an agreement, that is going to very much benefit the trust and also benefit local businesses, whatever. And then it gets canceled, or it gets postponed to put on a shelf long enough that the thing becomes stale and non-useful. And so it undercuts, I think, our ability to negotiate in good faith. People will say, well, what's that worth until it gets to the board, or politics intervenes. And so these are things that I know you can't control. So I'm just sort of expanding here, but I would say that our office does a great job, sometimes to no avail. I would say one thing that I would love to see, that I was happy to see in the report, New Mexico and Montana and Utah have offices that are very robust to examine opportunities to that again go beyond the traditional. And to look at opportunities, economic development, affordable housing would be a great thing that actually you could relate affordable housing to the success of our service industries in our cities, or the teachers who can't find a place to live and that sort of thing. Some of our communities are getting very expensive. So just look at the opportunities, and I think, I don't know if Director Scoggin actually wants a bigger office, but certainly if we wanted to see that done, it would have some implications. In the Utah, several years ago, they did a reform of school trust lands and created SITLA, which is in the report and describes what they do, but they operate off the income of the trust lands, which I don't know, that might be problematic with us where all the income has to go to schools. But that means that they run and they benefit and they operate off of their good work. So it's just an idea, one thing that Utah has been able to do. I will say that I think that the state has a lot of benefit for the school trust lands. And I'll just say also, when we were flush with cash, nobody really cared that maybe, you know, a bill passed, gave favoritism and cut rates and just gave sort of a sweetheart deals around. But I'll tell you, but now that we are counting every penny, we're aware of every penny that goes education, I think that has really focused attention on trust lands, the income. I think that competing interests sometimes can be, like for instance, adjacent landowners. If I've heard of bills say, well, you can't do something if the adjacent landowner is affected. You know, once again, it's the children, and then everything when it comes second. And you know, we have to be cognizant of local land use regulation, but ultimately, that question's in the courts right now. We will find out that how that authority balances and the competing interests there. We will find out, and but the first thing is inuring to the benefit of the beneficiaries. And so and the beneficiaries are the school children, and the rest is wonderful and can be also benefited, but you can't do it without the beneficiary. So I just leave you with those thoughts, and I'm so glad that this is getting the interest that I think it deserves, and I think we'll all benefit from. And with that, I will stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Herman. Any questions for Ms. Herman? Any questions? Very good. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Anyone else want to speak to this? Anyone online? Still no one online. Still no one online. All right. So public comment is closed. There is a motion on the table to change the statutory length of special use. Oh, I'm sorry. Representative Conrad, did you have something? We'll go back to the amendment. We'll pull it off the table. We're back on the motion. The motion, and I'll just restate it, and the maker of the motion can make sure it's a bill draft to change the special use maximum from 75 to 99 years. Is that accurate? That's accurate. All right. Representative Conrad, did you want to speak to that? Speak to the motion.
Yes, sir. Chairman Barlow, just a quick question for Representative Sherwood. What is the gap or the issue we're trying to resolve based on the additional 24 years? I'm not sure.
Okay, Representative Sherwood, if you'd like to respond.
Thank you, members of the committee. What I heard in listening to the testimony from OSLI is that banks are hesitant to look at commercial or residential projects at that 75-year lease limit, and that they would be more favorable to considering financing a project at that 99-year lease. And if I have misunderstood that, please open to correction.
Thank you. Any further questions or discussion on the motion? Does anybody want to hear from OSLI, whether they have a strong desire for this? No? No? All right, further discussion? Director Scoggins, did you want to offer anything here? Okay, she's shaking her head in negative. All right, further discussion on the motion, This is a motion for a bill draft, just a voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Motion is adopted. Representative Sherwood, did you have another motion?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this is more of wanting to gather recommendations from other states for compensation for improvements for residential and commercial development. So it is related to this topic, but I think I would like more information.
Okay, so everybody understand, there's no motion here, it's kind of a research request. Staff is nodding their head in the affirmative, they understand that. Do you think, does anybody have it without objection? We'll ask that to be accomplished. Without objection? All right, we'll have that accomplished. I'll just say, I think that the formula is already there because we do it for grazing leases. Let's just make it simpler and more direct. And maybe what we'll do is when we do get something produced, let's share it with OSLI, get some feedback, and maybe if you'll give me a little bit of prerogative, I'll maybe have a chairman's draft started, so that when we come to our next meeting, maybe we have something to start with. Is there any objection to that? If we have it in a timely manner? No objection. Our next meeting, just to remind the committee, is the Wednesday after Labor Day. As you will note, I try to pick days that are the second day of a working week. That's just my MO for scheduling committee meetings. If you ever want to know when Eric is going to schedule a committee meeting, starting the second day of a work week. All right, so we'll move forward with that. Anything further on this topic? All right, Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask the chair just to carry this subject forward to the next meeting, and with particular attention on slide 35 that you were referencing earlier on the full revenue generation obstacles that was given to us by the Office of State Lands and Investments. Those last 3 bullet points, I'd just like, need legislative authorization for sister agencies to use use of state trust lands. Second, no compensation structure when the general public utilizes state trust land for recreational purposes. 3, public land perception directing land management decisions. I'd like to request for OSLI and for maybe our staff too, to try to flesh that out. And if there's some sort of legislation that they could come and bring forward to us that could help them overachieve those obstacles. And so hold those for the next meeting, and the other two as well, if that comes up. But I just saw those 3, and if there was something that could be done, maybe have the staff take a look at it as well.
So I think what we're asking, I think the statutory limitations and staff pursuing that's encapsulated. Some of this other stuff, maybe let's get some direction or some thoughts out of the agency before our staff goes down all the rabbit trails. So if prioritize these and bring some things to our staff so we can and then if there is a place for I'll just say a chairman's bill draft, and some of these that look pretty straightforward, I'll go ahead and request it, and then we'll bring it, and that'll keep the discussion alive. If that's adequate, then we'll proceed that way without objection. Okay, so I think everything is still on the table. If there's something else that comes up, certainly open to that, but our next meeting is several months away, so we have plenty of time to try to work through some of this. Anything further for state lands issue? Anything further for that? Thank you, Director, Deputy Director. Thank you to those folks who testified, and our attentive audience who was with us all day. Anything else, committee, for the good of the order?
Mr. Chairman, can we
Yes,
just
Ms.
have you clarify the last directive that OSLI will prioritize their needs on slide 35, and then what?
So the first one is one I think LSO can kind of get some background on that, what other states may be doing on that one. I think that one's probably straightforward. What I've asked is for the remaining 4 is that the agency would look at what they think the statutory changes they might suggest, and then submit those to you, and we can see if there's a bill draft in that or something like that. Some of these are look, I'm just going to say, we're going to start talking about grazing lease formula discounts and market rates. This room is going to have 450 people in it, and we are going to be the most popular committee, absent appropriations in December. I'm just saying, let's be cognizant of what we're getting into when we get into some of these issues. So the sister agency use thing, I think that's something that, that's an executive branch function. We authorize that, et cetera. We start getting into the lease formulas and things like that, we're going to generate a lot of interest. That is a 2-year project. Some of these may be 1 year, some of them are 2 interim topics, I would suggest. And that's why I asked them to kind of prioritize what they thought was maybe closer to the quick. Anything further? Is that helpful, Ms. Sharp? Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anything more from our staff? Thank you very much for preparing the two documents. They were very helpful. Thank you, and they help not just us, but the public and at large about understanding some of these issues. Thank you for coordinating everything as well. One more comment from the audience. Come on up, Marguerite.
Thank you,
Please
Mr.
proceed.
Chairman. Marguerite Herman, and I'm going to address the first bill you took up today. Anyway, if I could, just briefly, about whether we need management audit committee or not. I'll just take 1 minute to address that. Standing committees perhaps are hard to evaluate. Okay, I'm just going to say where I think certain topics are best in a management audit committee, because standing committees, the way they're composed, are to compile people with interests, vested interests in topics, expertise, and which helps that committee get through all this work during the sessions in the interim. But it makes them, I think, less efficient at maybe doing program evaluation, because by definition, their membership has vested interest in those groups. And the Management Audit Committee over the years, I found a real value for arm's length staff, which I know staff helps all the committees, but with about program evaluation, where it, not all of it has become public, but I know that in some cases it has resulted in program improvements, maybe legislation, maybe not, maybe rules and regulations. But I think this committee occupies a very special part that is, and plus it's given the bandwidth to look at in depth for 1 year, 2 years, sometimes, a program that's complex, that's very important to the state. And to say that it's costly, yes, but when standing committees do evaluations, they use resources. When task forces, select committees, they use resources, staff, time, travel, all those expenses. And so I see a continuing and very important role for the Management Audit Committee. It maybe hasn't been used to the best effect in the past few years. I would say yes, probably, but it occupies, I think, an objective. It's not invested in work done by a particular standing committee over the past few years, so it can take a real critical look without maybe turf issues, which, as we all know, happens. People get sort of, they pick their issues and committees pick their issues and they don't like other people looking at it. I will confess that I did actually submit to the Management Council this year. I wanted a topic brought to the Management Audit Committee concerning school facility construction. This facility, the schools, the construction department and the school construction commission, facility commission, which have not been operating to the best effect. They've been wasteful, delaying, which in construction means wasteful. And it's been, I know, just, Laramie District 1 has had its own problems with delays and having to redo report after report after report. We can all think back on the years when the school construction department or the school facilities department counted hallway square footage against classroom foot. I mean, it has never worked well, I would say, since it started in the 90s. And so I was looking for a top to bottom review of that, and maybe the value of the School Facilities Commission that was added a few years ago, and I don't think has added any real value to the process, but I wanted actually an arm's length critical valuation of the process we use, because it just seemed to be wasteful and not efficient. And after all, we are operating under constitutional mandate for facilities. And was disappointed that didn't make it, but I thought, where else would it go? This was the only place I could think of. And so please don't go away. I mean, truly, and there may be ways to better use this investigative or evaluation piece of the legislature, but I see a real role for it going forward in cases like that.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm glad you thought of us at some point.
Mr. Chairman.
Because we do a lot of things. Some of them are arm's lengths and some of them are very critical. No pun intended, but we do a lot of things sometimes, but I don't know that it reaches the point where people understand the value of it to what you're trying to say, because where can we get more value? So please, Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out that there are two options on the table. And so, Ms. Herman, it is your position that you support the second bill draft for the biennium appropriation of $1.5 million and the addition of 6 employees, so we actually can do a program evaluation. Right now, we do not have the ability to do a program evaluation, which is why we're not doing any this interim. Not a single program evaluation is being conducted by this committee. LSO has told us that they do not have the bandwidth to do it. And so even though your request likely has merit, this committee perhaps could have taken that up. Theoretically, based on the purpose of the committee, we don't have any staff to get it done. That's the challenge.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Mr.
Thank
Chairman,
you.
I would say that's $1 well spent, and then you can deduct from that all the costs of all this, the work that would have been done by standing and select committees that now could be assigned to this committee. So I would endorse that idea. I think there's a role for it, and it definitely needs to be supported with sufficient resources.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? Further questions, Ms. Herman? Seeing none, thank you very much. And I apologize. You did say you were going to want to make comment, and I was about to run over you, so my apologies. All right. Anything further for the committee? Anything further for the good of the order? It is 3:55. I think we've had a very efficient and effective meeting today. I hope you feel the same way. We're going to have quite a few things come out. There will be a summary. I won't make Lily go through it right now, but we'll have a summary that she will send, and I will ask her to send it to the entire committee so that everybody's on the same page about where we are and what actions we took today and what your expectation is for the next meeting. So, anything further? Anything further? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.